What is the difference between seeing something and seeing something and writing it down? I believe there are multiple levels of difference. Seeing something with the intent of writing it down changes the quality of the seeing. You notice more detail in the immediate moment, and you are more alive to narratives that extend to the past and the future. I also believe that the act of writing changes us. We learn more about the world, and we learn more about ourselves, and we grow as people. That's why I advise all my writing students to write a journal. But intention isn't enough. You also have to have the will to keep at it, and perhaps the natural curiosity that drives seeing and writing. Once you are curious, once you learn to see, once you start to write, it becomes a virtuous cycle. If you haven't already taken up that habit, this is a good time to start.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Verma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Seema Goswami. She's a veteran of Indian journalism. She's been a reporter, an editor, a columnist, a novelist. Basically, she's someone who sees the world and writes it down. I've read her for decades now. I love the conversational tone of her writing, which is a model for all would-be columnists. Friendly without being frivolous, always thoughtful, always thought-provoking. She's reported and lived through some super interesting times and was kind enough to spare a few hours to talk to me. I love this conversation, and I'm now even more of a fan. I know you'll enjoy it too, but first, let's take a quick commercial break. Do you want to read more? I've put in a lot of work in recent years in building a reading habit. This means that I read more books, but I also read more long-form articles and essays. There's a world of knowledge available through the internet, but the problem we all face is, how do we navigate this knowledge? How do we know what to read? How do we put the right incentives in place? Well, I discovered one way. A couple of friends of mine run this awesome company called CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com, which aims to help people up-level themselves by reading more. A few months ago, I signed up for one of their programs called The Daily Reader. Every day for 6 months, they sent me a long-form article to read. The subjects covered went from machine learning to mythology to mental models and marmalade. This helped me build a habit of reading. At the end of every day, I understood the world a little better than I did before. So if you want to build your reading habit, head on over to CTQ Compounds and check out their Daily Reader. New batches start every month. They also have a great program called Future Stack, which helps you stay up to date with ideas, skills, and mental models that will help you stay relevant in the future. Future Stack batches start every Saturday. What's more, you get a discount of a whopping 2,500 rupees, 2,500 if you use the discount code UNSEEN. So head on over to CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com and use the code UNSEEN. Up-level yourself. Seema, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
It's such a pleasure having you on the show because I just know from before I'm going to enjoy this because I've been reading you for so many years. And I feel like I already kind of know you because you've got this really easygoing conversational style for your columns.
Thank you.
One straight away feels that, hey, one knows this person, like many people say of me also. Hey, we've
Yeah.
got so many episodes, you're like. And I'm intrigued by something you said
Yeah.
just outside.
Yeah.
I was raving about Shanta Gokhale's wonderful autobiography and about how much candor it is written with. And you pointed out that, hey, candor is not something you're really good at, which took me by surprise because I'm like, hey,
Yeah.
your columns have such candor in them. And you said that, no, there are two kinds of candor and I'm good at one.
That's true.
So can you
That's-
elaborate on that?
That's very true. Writing a memoir, you have to be really honest about uncomfortable moments in your life. Things that probably caused you pain or caused you discomfort or are not things you're happy to look back on. You need to go into those kind of things. I'm not good at that because I find that it's easier to move on than kind of dwell on things that have upset me or have caused me sorrow. So I find that very hard to do. So when I read memoirs of people who are, say, talking about the death of a parent or maybe the death of a spouse or a partner, or maybe, even not necessarily death, but even like, you've had a professional problem or you've had some sort of a low in your life. To write about that, you really have to go back to that space in your consciousness. You have to relive those moments. I find that very hard to do. The kind of candor I do in my column is actually a very superficial candor. It's about my life, but it's not about me. If you see the difference, it would be about the kind of things like the fact that I enjoy reading, how that makes me feel, how it takes me back in time, the fact that I like comfort reading. I reread the same books over and over again. That seems confessional, but it doesn't really give so much of myself away, if you see the difference. So I feel that there are two kinds of candor, and there's some people who are very good at a very deep candor, talking about their innermost feelings, talking about moments in their life that changed them. I haven't been able to do that as yet. Maybe at some point when I'm much older and I'm looking back on life and maybe I'm a little further away from events, maybe I'll be able to do that. But even in my columns, I don't really write about my life in the Shanta Gokhale kind of sense. I write about my life more in a, I'm trying to think of a suitable parallel, like who?
Nora Ephron?
Nora Ephron, yeah. Though Nora Ephron also wrote about her marriage breaking up
Yeah.
and all of that, but she had a certain lightheartedness. Like she would talk about cooking. She would talk about the process about writing a script or how everything was copy in her life. Then she would write about the whole female experience. I love that collection she did, which was I Feel Bad About My Neck, because it really kind of resonated with all women who are aging and are leaving their youth behind. It kind of resonates with you. And there's one bit where she says that I wish that when I was 26 or 27, I had put on a bikini and never taken it off again, because that was the time that I looked at my best. And it's that kind of confession. It doesn't take too much out of you because it's not that deep. And yet it is confessional because you are talking about yourself and how you felt at a point. But I feel I can do that sort of confessional, but I can't do the other sort.
And what you just said about, what she said about a bikini at 25, and I was going through your columns, and there's this
Yes.
lovely column about this 81-year-old lady who was in a bikini, and everybody was like, oh,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
have to applaud
yeah,
that and
yeah,
all. And you said something which really made me think, where you said that, if it was an 81-year-old man, he would not be, Paul McCartney would not be asked to
no,
pose in his
not at all.
underwear.
Yeah,
And why should women be,
yeah,
even if they can be objectified really well when they're old?
yeah. Why should they be?
Why should they be?
I think the expectation, first of all, I mean, that was Martha Stewart.
Hmm.
In fact, when I wrote that column, my editor at Brunch, Rachel, asked me, do you think anybody in India will know who Martha Stewart is? So I said, okay, maybe they won't, but it doesn't really matter. But because the point is of an 81-year-old being expected to do that. But the point is, there's all this expectation of how a woman is supposed to look. Like, you can be old and you can be gray, but your gray hair has to be just perfect. So Zeenat Aman is on Instagram rocking gray hair, but it's still blow dried, it's still well cut. And she has, I don't see very many wrinkles, but okay, she doesn't look like she did earlier. But all her pictures are still beautifully composed. She's still fully made up. It's just that she's an older version of what she used to be in her Dam Maro Dam days. So the expectations around a woman's appearance don't really change. It's not like she suddenly changed into Mary Beard or something. She still looks like a glamorous, grown old version of herself. And that's what struck me when I saw the Martha Stewart swimsuit thing, that even at 81, if somebody told me I had to squeeze myself into a swimsuit after dieting and after exercising, and then the poor photographer had to Photoshop most of my wrinkles out, and I had to pose in a certain way so that, your wrinkly bits don't show too much. I mean, how depressing would that be? I mean, if I was old and wrinkled, I'd just want to enjoy myself by the pool in a nice kaftan and do my own thing. I don't want to be the object of male or female gaze. I don't want to be even now. But at 81, I certainly don't want to be objectified in a certain way. And like you said, I don't see very many men doing that. I mean, Even Mick Jagger, who just turned 80, have you seen a single picture of himself showing his bits or, prancing about in a little Y front? No, he's still fully clothed. I mean, everybody says he looks great and, he exercises and he's so healthy, but you don't see him doing that sort of thing. So why is this expectation only on women? I just don't get it.
Yeah, absolutely. I was chatting with my friend Roshan Abbas just before I came to Delhi in
Mm,
Bombay, and Roshan told me about he heard this talk by an author of a book called The Culture Code many years ago.
mm,
And the point that gentleman was making,
mm,
not Roshan's point, but that gentleman's point, was that he was looking at certain instinctive desires that people have, which have
mm,
become part of the culture, and pointing out that they evolved that way. For example, the argument he was making was that back in the hunter gatherer days,
mm,
women would be out gathering a lot of stuff. Gathering a lot of stuff sounds weird, but
mm,
they'd be
yeah.
out gathering things. And what they carried that in was really important to them.
Mm,
So bags became important to them.
mm,
And therefore, for women, there is this sort of cliche that women love handbags and
yeah.
all of that. And equally for men who were out hunting, they had to cover large distances fast. So mobility became important to
Mm,
them, which is why men are kind of irrationally obsessed with, fast cars and so on and so forth. And kind of taking this further, when you think about the way that we have evolved, we have evolved in, if you if you read evolutionary psychology, there's all this about how the pressure on women to look good and for those superficial trappings is really intense, and the pressure on men on the other hand is to kind of be alpha males and be to show up, peacock's feathers for a man would be an expensive car or all of that. So in that sense, there's always pressure on a woman to look good in a bikini. There is never pressure on a man to look good in swimming trunks. And I think obviously a crucial component of modernity, of this whole project that sets us apart from all other species, is that we can fight our programming. We don't have to be that way. We don't have to conform to either those instincts or to those social
They're
codes.
not even, I would go further. It's not just instincts, but for most of human history, the only way that women have been able to protect themselves or to feed themselves even is to marry a man who will look after them. For
Exactly.
most of female history, they were not allowed to own property. They, even if they inherited property, it was given to their husbands to look after for them. So the only kind of, which is why Jane Austen is very important, because she makes that point in her books that marriage was the only opening that was open to women to progress in life. So you had to make a good marriage if you wanted a stable life for yourself, if you wanted somebody to bring up your children in a nice way with enough money to look after them or give them education. And that was really the only way you could go about it. And how does one make a good marriage? People are not really interested in a woman for anything other than her looks at that point. Of course, dowries came into it, not just in India, but even in Western countries, where the father was expected to make a settlement on the woman before she got married. So dowry was always part of it. But rich men always wanted beautiful women to improve their genetic makeup of their families. So I think that's also a major reason why women's looks are were so very important. They still are, but I think that's like a hangover of an earlier period. But when there are no other avenues to you can't work, you can't really study, you can't open a business. I mean, there are very few women who could actually look after themselves or feed themselves, or so then your looks becomes the one weapon you have in this world, which will actually open doors for you. So I'm not surprised that women are still obsessed with it, because it's almost like an atavistic memory in your mind that you have to look a certain way to be like that. No?
And earlier, you sort of you described the candor in your columns as a superficial candor, and that itself shows a lot of candor in making a confession like that. But I'll just point out to those of my listeners who may not have read you that the superficial is not in a pejorative way, but it's what you probably mean is more on the
On
surface
the
and
surface,
not
yes,
going deep.
absolutely. No.
But I find that a lot of your candor does go deep. Like one recent piece of yours which moved me a lot was about coming across these old photographs.
Yeah.
And I've sort of been discussing that on my show with some guests, because when my father died during the second wave, after about a year, we cleaned out his house, we sold it, we gave most of the things away. But I came across old photographs, of course, and old prints that were lying there. And it was very interesting for me to be able to see once again my parents not as my parents or as a father figure, mother figure who are,
Yeah.
embedded in your head, but as actual real people with insecurities, fears, unpleasant sides to their nature. All of those things, to see pictures of your parents when they are in their early 20s,
Yeah.
when they are the same age as I am now. And it's almost surreal. And there's another thing you pointed out in your column which struck me when I was looking through my old pictures, which is when you spoke about, in your column, there's a lovely picture of you and Veer when you're young,
Yeah.
and both of you looking just stunning. And you point out that you used to be harsh on yourself back then, but now you look back on your younger self and you realize that your insecurities of that time were unfounded and unnecessary, and that perhaps you should be kinder on yourself today as well, because 10 years later you could look back on yourself and say, hey, I'm just fine.
Yeah.
And I was always kind of filled with this kind of anger at the world and a certain kind of self-loathing. And when I look at my old pictures, I'm like, why was I so angry?
Yeah.
And it's fine, it wasn't
Yeah.
so bad.
Exactly. I so agree. We are, I don't know why that should be, but especially when you're young, you never feel you're good enough. You always feel like there's something wrong with you, even though you'll never probably be that thin again, never have such good skin again or such good hair again, especially for men.
Your hair looks incredible. Hello,
Oh,
excuse me. What are you talking about? Look
But
at my hair.
it's about 1/3 the quantity is left. So
Oh my God, come on, give me a break.
so but when you're young, I mean, honestly, for all the money in the world, I wouldn't be 25 again, because the amount of insecurities you have about yourself, or at least I did about myself, because you're constantly comparing yourself to other people and feeling that, you're somehow lacking. You're either not tall enough, not thin enough, not pretty enough, not bright enough. And you're always kind of, there's something that you find that you compare yourself unfavorably to. I think you need to be like maybe mid 30s and 40s before you learn to be comfortable in your own skin. And now, if a friend of mine tells me that, oh my God, I put on so much weight, I'm going on a diet, and I'm like, do it if you want to be healthy, but don't do it because you want to be thin. You need to be comfortable the way you are. I mean, you should be happy, be body positive about yourself. I don't think it's important to fit into this kind of mandated kind of image that we have of all women, all men, that you all have to look a certain way, or even this mandated, social construct that everybody has to be married. You have to have 2 children. Those children have to be one boy, one girl. They have to go to the best schools. They have to be good in their studies. Your husband has to drive a certain kind of car. You have to belong to the right clubs. I mean, that social mandate that we all go mad trying to fit into. And if we don't fit into it, we beat ourselves up about it. I think we need to kind of move beyond that and just be comfortable to be what you are. If you're single and you're happy, you're fine. If you're divorced and happy, you're fine. As long as you're happy and you're content with yourself, I don't think it's important to have these, kind of structures that you have to kind of blend into. I don't think that's important at all.
Yeah, and that journey you pointed out of being comfortable in your own skin, I remember took a long, long time for me.
Yeah.
And for some people, it just never happens. You see
Yeah.
them walk around with those anxieties
Yeah.
all their lives. And I'm just thinking that in modern times, those anxieties of what other people think of you or wanting to match up to certain, illusory standards is even harder than it used to be for us. Because, growing up, we mostly around us, either we saw larger than life movie stars and
That's true.
cricketers, or we saw people kind of like us. It's not such a big deal. But today you go to Instagram and Facebook and you have to compare your real life with the projected lives of others.
That's true.
And, there has been much talk of an epidemic of teenage female depression
Yes.
in the US and suicides. And Instagram has been blamed for a significant part of it, because you're always kind of struggling to keep up
Yeah.
in that race.
And even though those images are not probably real, I mean, most of them are filtered, and people thinify themselves and put all kinds of stuff on it or whatever, so they're not real at all. But try telling a 16-year-old girl that. I mean, she doesn't see it that way. It's actually because, and it's not just girls. I find that even boys are now coming under that stress, because you have to have that six pack, that you see all the film heroes and all your Instagram influencers doing. Even like 30 and 40-year-old men, I mean, the number of men around me that I see going in for hair transplants, which was not even a thing. Like, when I was growing up, you never, I mean, men turned bald all the time, but they kind of made their peace with it and, moved on. But even people who are not in the glamour business, they feel they have to look their best. So it's not just women who are doing that. I think men have as much pressure to look good. I was reading a story recently about how people are having Botox and stuff like that because they don't want to look old within a corporate environment, because they feel that if they look too old, then they may be just, shunted out and their jobs may be given to younger people. So it's important to look young and virile. So even men are having Botox and, getting their hair colored. So it's a very insidious sort of situation where everybody feels obliged to look a certain way, to kind of dress a certain way, to and you're right, it's social media that's really kind of propelling this whole growth in terms of not just teenagers, even middle-aged women or middle-aged men. It's all over.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I'm glad that, like, I would have loved to be young today, because the world is so full of possibilities. You can
Yeah.
learn anything you want,
Yeah.
you can create anything you want. But at the same time, I worry about where my anxieties would have taken me. Maybe I would have wanted to build my
Yeah.
body and look
Yeah.
a certain way and have a hipster beard and all of that nonsense.
Yeah.
And I think the journey towards finding ourselves, I wonder if you'd agree, is sort of like, in my generation, in our generation, we kind of stumble towards finding who we are.
Yeah.
Right.
Very
Whereas
true.
today, I worry that you could be forced into particular shapes and never really,
Yeah. Yeah, very true. We didn't have these kind of anxieties. I mean, there were people around us. I mean, there were magazines, of course, I mean, which had these glamorous images. But somehow in that world, we didn't aspire to be exactly like the models. We saw the models as a different species and a different breed, and we didn't really aspire to be like that. But when you see, say, somebody you go to school or college with putting up an Instagram portrait in, say, Nice or, the Caribbean, wearing a bikini and, with her highlights and a nice straw hat or whatever, now that seems aspirational. You feel like, oh, I was in school with her. She can do this. Why can't I? So, that kind of stuff is actually damaging in an entirely different way. And also I find, I don't know, maybe I'm just old fashioned, but I find that people don't really want to work at normal jobs any longer. They all want to be like, I want to be a social media influencer, or I want to be like, arts photographer. And I often wonder who is going to do the mundane jobs if everybody wants to do this. But when I see my nieces and my nephews who are just kind of in college and starting out in their world, there are very few of them. I have one nephew who's just joined the NHS as a psychotherapist, but I think he's the only one who's happy doing a normal conventional job, whereas everybody else wants to do something exotic and unusual.
No, and while I'm glad that so many avenues have opened up for everyone, the one that really amuses me is that social media influencer one, because it's like being famous for being famous.
But they make so much money.
Yeah, they do.
It's just crazy because a friend's daughter does this, and it's crazy the kind of money that brands will pay. I mean, it's just because you have followers and the right kind of followers who will buy what you buy. But I don't know. But it's a very stressful job to have, because you're constantly thinking of, generating copy for your handle and constantly thinking of what to do. So it's not an easy job by any means. So I wouldn't recommend that to anybody.
Yeah, and it's not even a job. I mean, typically, I would imagine that the way our generation would think of it is that if you become an influencer, you become an influencer by being excellent at
At
something,
something, yeah.
and then you get whatever influence you get.
They are excellent at influencing.
Excellent at influencing. Yeah, like a friend told me recently that, hey, if the 100,000 Instagram followers is a magic number, if you get there, you're going to get paid and you can just live off
Yeah.
that. And it's like a
But the
self-replicating
worrying bit
machine.
is that a lot of people just buy followers. I mean, they're not even genuine followers.
No, but you have tools actually by which you can
You can
figure
tell,
out.
yeah,
Yeah,
you
you
can
can kind
tell.
of figure out depth
Wow.
of engagement to followers.
But there's some people whose Instagram handles are followed by like so many Russian people, and I wonder where do all these people come from and how do they know you?
Well, I mean, Raj Kapoor had a following in Russia,
Yeah, true.
so
Very true. Well, I mean, my Instagram is really limited to documenting my travels, and that's about it. And unfortunately, nobody pays me to do that. So, but if you're listening, I'm happy to be paid.
Yeah. No, so you know what? I think the last time this happened was 2 years ago. Twice I have been approached by people saying that my girlfriend slash boyfriend is a big fan of your show and their birthdays and so and so. Can you please record a message saying welcome to the Scene and the Unseen, happy birthday, so and so. So I just did it out of goodwill. Why not? I just have to press a button and it's done. And now apparently there is a flourishing market in the US where you can actually pay celebrities to do
Cameo, yeah.
custom-made little things like that. And
it's called Cameo, I think, right?
yeah, yeah.
And people get paid. Even Richard Schiff does it. Can you believe it?
Wow, I have no idea who Richard Schiff
Oh,
is.
the guy who played Toby in West Wing.
Okay, I see. Okay.
Are you a West Wing fan?
I'm afraid I haven't seen the
Oh
show.
my God, you haven't seen it. You have such a treat awaiting you. You have to watch it. All 8 seasons of it. It's one of the best political shows ever. I think I've seen the whole thing thrice.
I think 3 years ago or 4 years ago, my good friend Prem Panikkar gifted me a full DVD set
And
of
you
that.
haven't watched it?
And I haven't watched it because nobody has a DVD player these days. But I think he gifted me the set if I remember
I
correctly.
have a DVD player. I'll loan
No,
it to you.
no.
Loan it to
I can just watch it online now. So,
No,
but,
it's actually very sadly, it's gone off the streamers. It was on Amazon Prime, which is where I saw it again recently. And now it's gone off, and I don't know where you can watch it. So please get a DVD player, hire one.
now that you have added your voice to Prem's voice, I will certainly do so.
He recommended it highly, didn't
Highly,
he?
highly,
Yeah,
yes.
it's one of the best shows ever. Oh my God, I can't believe you've not seen it.
I apologize. Don't get angry. So, yeah.
It's really an amazing show. I'm really jealous of you now. You get to see it afresh.
Oh, wow. Which is actually a very sweet way of looking at it. Someone who's actually watched everything there is to watch, their life is over.
Exactly. What else is there to do?
I'm sure this.
But during the lockdown, for instance, I'm pretty sure we finished Netflix. I think we saw everything there was worth seeing, and there's nothing left to watch. But do you watch a lot of these streaming services or no?
I enjoy it when I do, and when if 10 people recommend something, then I'll watch it. Like right now, this is the 27th of July we are recording, and I don't know when the episode will be out. But right now, all my friends are saying watch Korra and watch The Hard.
Oh, it was really good.
Yeah,
Korra was
so-
really good.
So many people have recommended it that I have to watch it now. But
The
it's
Hard I
just
have not seen, but I'm Punjabi, though most people think I'm Bengali because of Goswami and growing up in Calcutta.
that's what I thought.
Yeah, but I'm Punjabi actually. So that kind of resonated with me because it's mostly in Punjabi and
Yeah.
you don't really see many Punjabi serials really. And they really captured that ethos of Punjab, the way things work. And there's not that unnecessary sensationalism like most of these OTT things do, where there's constant, abuses and stuff. I mean, there are abuses because it's Punjab after all, but it's not done gratuitously. So and they bring in a lot of stuff, but I don't want to spoil it for you. You see it for yourself.
Yeah, I was having dinner last night with this dear friend of mine, Vikram Bajaj, and he told me of a scene from The Hard where apparently this guy has been stripped to his undies and he's asked to get something which is in his pant pocket. So he reaches behind and then he realizes he's not wearing his pants. So he just says pantich. And I think that is just so beautiful and pithy, and it cannot.
Yeah.
And apparently, it was translated on the screen as the so and so object is in my trouser pockets, and that was a subtitle. But all he's saying is pantich, which is
great.
Which is so great. Actually, you mentioned growing up in Calcutta, and let's talk about your childhood. The part I find most fascinating, and sometimes I realize that people like you and me, we take a lot of shared experiences, shared influences for granted. And the truth is that more than 70% of India was born after liberalization, right? So they've just grown up in a different world.
Very true.
And a lot of what we take for granted is something that will be new or even TIL for them, So, and I'm half Bengali. So even though I now find you're a Punjabi and not a Bengali at all, but I'm
What
half
is
Punjabi also.
you're half and half, yeah?
I'm
Okay.
half and half.
Okay.
Yeah. So you were. So tell me about your childhood. What were your young years like? What were your parents like?
Oh my gosh. So, my family is actually from what is now Pakistan. So, my father's side of the family came from this small village in Jhelum district, which is near Lahore, and so they moved to Calcutta after partition, and
My
so I
dad, by
grew
the
up
way,
there.
was born in Shekhupura near Lahore and moved to
Oh,
Calcutta after.
to Calcutta as well. Wow.
But I think before partition, but never
Okay. Yeah.
similar
Same
similar time.
story. So they moved after that, but the thing in Calcutta was that there was a very big Punjabi community, because and especially a big Sikh community. So I grew up, actually my first language is Punjabi. So I grew up speaking Punjabi. In fact, I remember when I first went to school, I didn't really speak much English. I actually had to learn English after going to school, and it was actually quite difficult for me. And because and I remember as a child once, coming to Chandigarh to visit my aunt, and I was so astonished because everybody in the shops was speaking Punjabi. And in my mind, Punjabi was like the secret language we spoke at home, and everybody outside would speak Bengali or Hindi or English. And I was astonished that, everybody speaks Punjabi. How is this even possible? But anyway, to get back to growing up in Cal, it was a much simpler time, because as you said, it was before liberalization. There weren't that many things to buy or that many things to do. I As a child, we didn't even have television. I mean, television came when I think I was in class 9 or 10, or around that time, and you basically had to make your own entertainment. And I was the third child of the family, so my brother and sister were much older than me. My sister's about 15, 16 years older than me, and my brother's 11 years older than me. So, of course, they made my life miserable by saying that I was never meant to be born and I was an accident, and you know how cruel children are. So I was always told that, you're not really meant to be here. But the good thing about it is that my parents were like so fed up bringing up kids. So by the time I came along, there was like minimal supervision. Like they had no idea what I was doing. Like, my Bengali friends, their mothers would come home, come to the school with a little tiffin and feed them with their hands and stuff. And my mom would just pack something and send me off with it. And she had no idea if I had exams or anything. I would be studying on my own, maybe not, or maybe yes. But there was like minimal supervision. And my mother had this ritual that, we lived in a joint family with my grandparents and everyone. And she was incredibly busy because she had to do breakfast and lunch and dinner. I mean, even though there was help, but she still had to do all of it. So she was very particular that from 2 to 4, she was going to retire to her room to sleep or read or do whatever, and nobody was allowed to knock on the door or disturb her. And if you did, I mean, you better be bleeding or on the verge of death before you did that. So I used to wait till she kind of went to her room at 2, and then I would slip out of the house and I would roam the neighborhood and go into gardens and I would eat all kinds of vegetation that I saw growing on the roadside. I had another friend of mine who was a year older than me in the neighborhood, and we'd go around and we'd find these little leaves that tasted tart, and we would eat them. And now looking back, I think that no child in today's age would ever be allowed to do those kinds of things that we got up to. And I remember once we were roaming around barefoot in the garden and a snail got attached to my foot. And then I didn't know what to do because I couldn't tell my mother that I had this accident, because I would have to confess that I had left the house while she was asleep. And I can't remember what I did, but I basically took care of it myself. So I had a great childhood actually, because I was allowed to explore. I was allowed to do my own thing. There was no real pressure on me to study, though I was a studious child. It's not like I didn't, but it wasn't like my parents were asking me to do it. It was just my own innate competitive nature that I had to be good at whatever I did that made me do it. And even growing up, like, when I was going into college, like a lot of my friends had this pressure that you have to study engineering and you have to study medicine and all of that. And to their credit, my parents never ever made any preference known. It was up to me. And I wanted to study literature, which I did. And they never ever said, what are you going to do with it? What is your, plan in life? And, what's your job going to be after that? They were happy to let me do what I wanted to do, which looking back is an incredible privilege, because the kind of pressure that's put on children to do things that they don't really want to do, they're not maybe, suited to do. And I mean, the one subject I always really did badly at was physics. So if my parents had tried to force me to become an engineer, I don't know what would have become of me. So looking back, I think I had an incredibly privileged childhood. It's not like there was a lot of money and I could go out and buy what I wanted. It wasn't like that. Like, even when it came to buying books, I had a certain budget. I could not exceed that. But like, my mother would take me to these lending libraries on Free School Street, and we would become members of 3 or 4 of them. And every Saturday we would go, and I think we were allowed to take 2 books from each. So I'd get 6 books which I could read through the week, and that used to be like the high point of my life. I used to come back. The moment I came back, I would put out a chair in the veranda and settle down to read immediately. So you had these little pleasures, and you had these, little things that kept you excited. You had your friends in the neighborhood who would come and chat with you. So it was a kind of an idyllic childhood. There were no screens, there was no social media. So it was very, very different. And when I see my nieces and nephews growing up now, I mean, their parents are frightened to even let them into the neighborhood park on their own. It just seems like a completely different world.
I think what you were lucky to have, which they possibly will never know, is 2 to 4.
Yes.
And that's such a lovely thought of, that the Calcutta of your childhood, in a sense, was a Calcutta between 2 to 4,
Yes.
quite a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Calcutta would go to sleep, no? And do you remember, did you grow up in Cal?
No, I've
No.
been there, but I didn't
Yeah.
grow up there.
There used to be, I don't know why it never happens now, but there used to be this ritual that every evening they would clean the streets with water. They would take pump hoses and they would kind of hose the streets down. I don't know at what point it stopped, but as a child, I have such a strong memory of that. And every time you went out in the evening, the air would be cooler because the streets had been cooled down and everything would be nice and clean. And then I suppose because of water shortages, they must have stopped, but it doesn't happen any longer. But Calcutta was a great place to grow up. I really have great memories of it. And even going to college, I went to a girls' college. I went to Loreto College, and which was more like a school actually, because we had assembly in the morning, and we had a nun as our principal who would take assembly, and we'd have prayers and all of that. And you were not, I mean, nobody was allowed to kind of leave the college except for the lunch break. So the only way you could bunk was if you didn't come back after lunch break and you missed your afternoon classes. But we were such good girls that we never actually bunked. We all came back and did our lessons. But it was actually a lot of my friends went to presidency and loved it and enjoyed that, whole kind of atmosphere over there. But I actually like being an all girls environment, because I think the bonds you form with female friends are terribly important at that age. And to be in an environment which is not distracted is the wrong word, but where there are no men around to muddy the waters,
Free of the male gaze.
free of the male gaze, that's a good way to put it, was actually a great way to grow up. It was an amazing experience.
Tell me about your parents, because when I think of the men and women of that time, and all the stories that previous guests of mine have told me, and just looking back at my own parents, and I find this really interesting because it's almost as if the roles that they are thrust into are just hardened. A man is supposed to be a certain way, he's supposed to be a provider, he's supposed to be stern with the kids, he's, supposed to not cry in public. Women are supposed to look after the house and be a completely different way, and all of that. And you will find couples who gradually, out of shared love and perhaps, being more influenced to Western literature and all that, are kind of don't exactly conform to those roles and become very close. And you also find couples that remain close and full of love with each other, but they're also almost in separate worlds. They're together, but they're alone, where the woman could have an interior life, but it's her interior life. Her husband
Yeah.
has no idea that is a world, and her husband could also be constricted along his own groove and into which he never allows her. So, what were your parents like? What was their relationship with themselves, with each other, and with you?
It's so hard to say because, when you're a child, you don't really see your parents as individuals. You just see them as your mom and your dad. You don't even think about their relationship with each other. As far as you're concerned, they're only like your parents, and, that's about it. I can only really think about it in retrospect because, to be honest, when I was growing up with the two of them, I never really thought about it or even asked them about it, their relationship or whatever. Like, for instance, as I wrote in my column, they got married without ever seeing each other. Like, the first time my mother saw my father was when she got married to him, was at the Jaimala. And her photograph was sent to my grandparents, and they shared a photograph of my father. And in all my life, I often wonder that why didn't I ever ask her how that felt like to marry a man you do not know, to then move into an entirely different family where you don't know anybody, where you're expected to instantly become the bahu of the house and take over. And she was just 18 when she got married, which is like really really young in retrospect. But I don't think I ever asked her that question, how that felt. I mean, you know and maybe I should have. But and she also had a very difficult life because she was 6 when her mother passed away. Her father used to, this is in British India, he used to work for the railways. And so her mother passed away, leaving like, how many, 6 children or something. Yeah, six children. So he got remarried and had one of my masis was born through the second wife, who also died. I mean, obviously there was a huge mortality rate when it came to women giving birth. And then he got married for a third time, from whom I have my youngest mama. And touch wood, we're all very close as a family, so we don't really regard ourselves as a step family. But basically, my mother, from the age of 6, did not have a mother. And in fact, she had no memory of what her mother looked like, and didn't remember her at all. And of course, there were no pictures in those days that she could have seen. So I think she didn't have any role model of a mother to base herself on. So I often think that she probably struggled because she had my sister when she was 19. And my sister was practically brought up by my grandmother, because I think my mother was still a child in some ways. But by the time I came around, she was about 35. So I think I was probably the child that she probably was a mother to, in the real sense, because she was like a mature person, and she kind of. And I know my father was far more involved in my bringing up than he was in the bringing up of my brother and sister, because they were so much, he was also so much younger when they were born. So it was almost like, a couple of children having children, and how it is, and the entire extended family looking after the kids. But I wonder, I mean, I really don't know. It's just speculation, that what does that do to your relationship? Like, how do you relate to each other? Do you relate to each other only as parents, or do you relate to each other as, a husband and wife? Do you have like this romantic bond or whatever? But I really don't know how it worked out. I can only speculate.
And how did your relationship with them then change over the years? Because what you're saying, I think, is true of everyone, that we first see our parents as parents.
Yeah.
One charming anecdote I keep coming back to is one that Natasha Badwa told me in her episode with me.
Mm.
When she and her then boyfriend, now husband, they introduced their parents to each other.
Mm.
And each of them found the other's parents to be completely different from how they had been portrayed. Because, in your own mind, your parents are a particular way.
Yeah.
But actually, they contain multitudes. They're much more than that.
Yeah.
They've evolved past all of that. And that's.
My dad died when I was 24. So I think maybe if he had lived, he was like 68 when he died. And he died quite young. And when you're 24, I don't think you have the maturity really to look beyond the appearances and try and see the person, as what he is. So my memories of my father are still very, childhood oriented. And, like, I had just about started working at my first job when he passed away. My mother lived on for about 30 years after that. She passed away only in 2015, when she was 87 when she died. So with her, I had, a longer period of time, to for the relationship to evolve or whatever. And with my mother and me, we are very similar personalities. We're both very strong-willed people who have to have our own way. We are both quick-tempered. I won't call it bad-tempered, but quick-tempered. Like, we lose our patience very easily. So we were not really a natural fit that way, because we were constantly rubbing against each other, especially when I was a teenager and going to college. Had these constant clashes with each other or whatever. Whereas my father was far more laid back, and he didn't have very strong opinions about anything. So I probably got along better with my father in those days. But as my mother grew older, I think, A, she mellowed. Two, she became, it happens with all parents, they become more dependent on you. So you become more like the parental figure, and they become like more childlike. So that transition took place with my mother, but I never really had a chance with my father because he died when I was so young. So that didn't really happen. But with my mother, our relationship changed as she grew older, because she started off as being this very strong and, almost obstreperous person. And by the end, she was like a very different person. She was like, you know, she would depend on you for the smallest little thing. And you could tell that, it was not something she was comfortable with, because she had grown up being this very independent person who did her own thing. And in her last years, she had to move in with my sister and live with her, because she couldn't really live on her own. And I think it was very tough on her, giving up your house, giving up your environment, moving in. It changes your life in a very fundamental way. And I think it's very hard to make your peace with. So I think that's tough. And I often wonder, like, with as you grow older, what your old age will hold for you. It's a bit scary.
There's a beautiful poem by A.K. Ramanujan called Self Portrait. I'll just read it out as I get to my next question.
Yeah.
Self Portrait by A.K. Ramanujan. I resemble everyone but myself, and sometimes see in shop windows, despite the well known laws of optics, the portrait of a stranger, date unknown, often signed in a corner by my father.
Oh,
And it's a beautiful poem. And how much did knowing your mother better help you also understand yourself,
help me understand myself.
or help you know
Now that's a
yourself?
tough one. I don't know if I understand myself. I don't know. I think it helped me understand my mother better, because I think, anybody who loses their mother at such a small age is always damaged as a consequence, because you grow up without a maternal influence. And I think that changes you in a very, very fundamental way. So when she became a mother herself, her mothering had no real context, because she had no idea, what to do. And that, I think, affected her. Like, she was a huge disciplinarian, because her father used to be a huge disciplinarian. So she took her cue from him. So there wasn't that softening influence of a mother that, in the stereotypical way where what we say. So she was like, in our family, my mother was always the disciplinarian. My father was always like, it's okay, let it be, or whatever. But she was the one who was like the tough one, or whatever. And in a sense, I think it was her childhood that made her. And in turn, it made us, because the way she brought us up was influenced by the way that she was not brought up. So it was a tough thing. But I don't know if I could understand myself better as a consequence, but I certainly understood where she was coming from. Like, when I was growing up, I would kind of constantly rebel against the disciplinarian aspects of her personality. Like, for instance, when we were kids, we were never allowed sleepovers. We were not allowed to sleep over at anybody's house ever. And it used to be a huge issue for me that, all my friends can do it, why can't I do it, or whatever. But I think because she was brought up by this very strict father who had to protect his daughters in a household where there were no ladies or whatever, she kind of carried that over to her own parenting. So looking back, I can now understand where she was coming from. But at that point, there used to be a lot of anger and resentment that why can't I do the things that, my friends are doing or whatever. But certainly looking back, I feel I understand her better now, but I don't think I understand myself any better as a consequence. That'll take some time.
Yeah, it's a kind of lifelong process.
Yeah.
You mentioned you were crazy about literature. You like to read. You would,
I love it,
6
yeah.
books a week, and you would just go through
yeah.
them. Tell me about the kind of things you read and what stayed with you. What made an impression?
Oh my gosh, I like I told you, like within the house, I was completely unsupervised. I wasn't allowed to go out anywhere and I had to be back at a certain time and all that nonsense. But within the house, there was no supervision. And my grandfather, my father, my brother, my sister, they were all big readers. So we had a lot of books at home, which was unusual in that period where, and my grandfather used to be a huge history buff, so he used to have books on world wars and the British royal family and European royalty and stuff like that. And somehow nobody ever said that I should not read anything. Like I could read whatever I wanted to read. And I still remember there used to be this huge bound volume of George Bernard Shaw's collected plays. And I remember I must have been about 10 or 11 when I started reading them. And I'm not even sure that I understood what they were or whatever, but I read all of them, because nobody ever told me that, these are adult books and you can't do this and you can't do that. As a consequence, I developed a pretty eclectic reading habit. Like I would read his history books, I would read these plays. Then my sister was a big fan of Georgette Eyre, so I would pick up her Georgette Eyres and read them. So I don't have memories of any one particular thing that I liked. Like all children, I loved Enid Blyton because that was the one thing that we all read, the Mallory Tarr series. And I used to fantasize about being allowed to go and live in a hostel and where I would have midnight feasts. And of course, my mother would not send me, which was a big bone of contention that I couldn't go and live in a hostel. And so those were there, and there were the Nancy Drew books. Then there used to be a lot of books. The school library was one resource that I used. And then I said I used to go out and pick up books from these lending libraries, which I don't know if they still exist in Calcutta or whether they've gone. But and then there used to be this Oxford library on Park Street where you could borrow books as well. So I had a very eclectic reading habits, which continue to this day. Though now I don't read that much non-fiction. I read much more fiction than non-fiction than I used to. But like I'm very happy reading a trashy potboiler, kind of thing. I used to read Harold Robbins that my brother had, and James Hadley Chase. Do you remember him?
Of course.
Yes. And Alistair MacLean, that used to be a big name in those days, the Guns of Navarone and all of that. It was just made into a movie as well. Those books seem to have disappeared, haven't they?
Yeah, I kind of, one lament I have is that today everything is so easily available to us
Yeah.
that people can actually curate their reading.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, people often do it according to ideas of how they want to project themselves or what they think is cool to
Yeah.
read. And I'm like, we were indiscriminate readers because we didn't have a choice. We read whatever we could get our hands on.
Yeah. In fact, I remember once I'm a big fan of Georgette Eyre. I think she's an amazing writer. And her plots are like really great. And I remember once I was working for Sunday Magazine and I was at the airport and I was reading a Georgette Eyre that I'd picked up from one of these airport stalls, probably rereading it because I'd read them all like when I was a child. And Avik Sarkar wandered into the airport. He looked at me and said, "What are you reading?" And I said, "It's a Georgette Eyre." He said, what nonsense are you reading? This is all trash and all that. Mills and Boons type and all. So I was really annoyed. I said, have you ever read a Georgette Eyre? Have you any idea what she is like and stuff like that? So of course he scoffed at me and wandered off, and I was like really annoyed. Then after a month, he called me up and he said, I think you were right about Georgette because Amitabh Ghosh told me she's one of the best writers. So I said, oh, Amitabh Ghosh's opinion counts, but not mine. But because of that, I'm a pretty eclectic reader. I read about just about anything. Though my big craze is still spy novels. I grew up reading them, so they're still like one of my favorite genres to read.
Yeah, and one of my good friends, Ajay Shah, keeps talking about the importance of biodiversity in our diet. So every time he makes tea, he'll put different herbs into it.
Oh, really?
And I think that there's the same value in biodiversity in your reading, as it were. Like, I teach a writing course, and sometimes students will ask me that, what should I read? Recommend some writers and all of that. And I'm like, anything you enjoy reading is great.
Yeah.
There should be no hierarchy of books that, something has won the Booker Prize or
Yeah.
something is in the
Yeah.
canon and something is airport bestseller.
Yeah.
Anything that gives you joy, that
Yeah.
you enjoy reading is good writing. It is doing something right,
Yeah.
and you will internalize it and
Yeah.
you should read it.
In fact, I had this thing which I'm now trying to get over, that once I started a book, I had to finish it. I couldn't give it up. No matter how bad it was or how bored I was, I would still read 3-4 pages at night trying to finish it. But now I've decided that life is too short. I mean, there's so many other books to be read. So if something doesn't appeal to me, I kind of give it up now. But there was a time when I never used to do that, and I used to kind of religiously read through. Because there are a lot of these very popular and well-known writers that I just don't get. They just don't appeal to me. So I don't see any reason why I have to read them just to prove that, I've read this particular book or whatever. Like God of Small Things. I couldn't read it. I tried 3 times and I gave it up. And then people would ask me, how can you not like it? It's Arundhati. But I just
I mean,
couldn't.
my tastes also go much more towards minimal, elegant prose like
Yeah.
Vikram Seth and
Yeah,
so
Vikram Seth
on,
is amazing.
rather than someone more maximalist, which is
Yeah.
not a objective
It's not
value
a value
judgment. It's just
judgment.
our taste. This
Yeah.
is how we are.
I get a bit tired of all these lyrical, the purple sky and the blue.
Yeah. No, the other thing that I kind of keep telling my writing students is that, and contrary to what you do in this case, is that if you don't like something, stop reading it immediately.
Yeah,
It's a
good.
sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah.
You should only read something if it brings you value in 2 ways. One is you're enjoying it,
Mm.
and the other is that you want to learn something,
You're
and even
learning
if it's a
something.
little difficult, you want to learn it.
Yeah.
But otherwise, never force yourself through anything because life is so short.
In fact, at the moment I'm reading this really, really interesting series. It's quite a quirky series actually. It's by this writer called S.J. Bennett, in which he writes these books in which is set in the palace. Queen Elizabeth is actually the secret detective who's solving all these crimes.
Wow.
And it's so quirky and it's so fun because she puts in a little bit about palace life and how the queen's world works and whatever. And some hand washes up on the beach at Sandringham, and who's the man to whom the hand belongs to. And the queen is trying to find out from behind the scenes, and one of her ADCs is like her front, who does all her work for her, because obviously the queen can't go and investigate. But I just found this such fun because the concept is so quirky that I was just intrigued by it. It's not a very highfalutin book or whatever. It's good, easy reading, but I'm really enjoying it at the moment. It's good fun.
No, I love the thought. And our, producer for this session, Abhishek, who plays guitar, and
Mhm.
Advaita, he was lamenting yesterday that there aren't enough chronicles set in the princely states of India.
Yeah,
I mean, of course, Manupil is written about Travancore and all of that, but there aren't enough. And I was just thinking, what about a detective series set in one
It
of
would be
those
so
princely
great.
courts? Would be so
It
so
was
much
so
fun.
great. Funny you should say that because I remember Chiki Sarkar many years ago said, would you like to do this kind of book and all? And unfortunately, I don't have that historical background. You need somebody who understands that period to do it. But it'll be a great thing for somebody to do.
I think Madhulika Lidl has
Has
a
she
series.
done? I've not read
I think
her.
in the Mughal courts, there's a series
Oh, I
like
haven't
that,
read
if I'm
that.
not mistaken. You mentioned Mallory Towers earlier and sort of Daydreams of Boarding School. And obviously, anyone who read Enid Blyton and all that would kind of feel that attraction. And I love Mallory Towers as well. And I
Mhm.
remember when I was in Bishop School in Pune in the 1980s,
Mhm.
at one point when my father was transferred to Pune, I insisted that I wanted to be, not a day scholar, but a hostelite.
Ah.
And he was like, what are you talking about? I live here. What are you kidding me? Etc., etc. So that never happened. But for a very brief while, I had that little fantasy.
Fantasy.
Purely because of the books you read.
Yeah, it's crazy.
But I want to sort of ask you, what did you daydream about? Were you a daydreamer?
Oh, yes, my gosh. As a child, I used to create such elaborate fantasies in my head. Oh my God. I was like, when there's such a big gap between your siblings and yourself, you're effectively brought up as an only child because they are like grown up by the time you're whatever. And so I had this very rich interior life, and I used to have all these fantasies. And one, I used to be the captain of the Indian female cricket team, and we used to go off on all these little tours, and in my mind I would be replaying every ball in my head and what stroke I would be playing and all of
Wow.
that. So I had a lot of these, the fantastical things in my head because we had so much free time and nothing to do with it apart from read. And when you read, it kind of unlocks your imagination to some extent. And so yeah, I had a huge daydream, but I never really daydreamt of being a real thing. Like, it's not like in real life I was actually a cricketer. It was like a complete
Complete fantasy. Me
fantasy,
too, yeah.
it wasn't like I was fantasizing about something that could actually come to fruition. It wasn't like that at all.
And were there romantic daydreams? Like, I'm wondering what were the notions of romance in that time? Because at one level, if you're not a reader, you just get Bollywood, and you
Yeah.
get either really straight-laced conventional notions of romance, or they could even be a little toxic because Bollywood could sometimes be that way. But if you read, there could be
Yeah.
more and more nuance out there. So, what was it like growing up
I
as a
think
young
our
girl, young
idea of
woman?
romance came from Mills and Boon's novels. At that age, when you're like 15, 16, they were like contraband almost, because they used to have these very lurid covers of these very pretty looking women fainting in the arms of this dark, handsome man. And I think either we were not allowed to read them or there was something, but we used to secretly exchange whatever books we had with, each other. So I think we had this very stereotypical idea of romance, that this very strong, tall, dark man would come into our lives who would always be a little older than you, not, somebody of your same age group, and sweep you off your feet and go off. But in real life, we didn't know very many men because I went to a convent school and then I went to Loreto College, so there weren't that many men around. And even when we went to these, college festivals or whatever, we always steered a little clear of this whole St. Xavier's lot, because their idea of trying to make friends with you was trying to tease you, was trying to, I mean, it was a very strange dynamic. Nobody would come up and say hi, hello, but they would catcall you from a distance. How it is when you're like 17 or 18. So it's not like we had very many romances when we were in college. In fact, of all my friends in college, only one had a boyfriend. And even that was a secret boyfriend. Like, her parents didn't know about it or anything. And it was not until what? We were 24 or 25 that people started getting married. And astonishingly, a lot of them were arranged marriages. Even in the 90s or 80s or whatever, only one friend of mine actually had a love marriage, the one who had a boyfriend in college. And the other one, you know, we didn't call them arranged marriages because, the boy would be introduced to you by your parents or whatever, and then you would go out with him a couple of times. So you felt that, you were like dating, and then you would get married. But effectively, they were arranged marriages, whether you call them or not. So I think it was a very different period. They weren't, or maybe it was different in presidency. Maybe people had lots of boyfriends and girlfriends. But growing up in Loreto, there were very few people who. There was one girl in our class who actually got married while we were still in college, and that was also an arranged marriage. So it was a very kind of a conservative, traditionalist kind of an environment that I grew up in.
And earlier you mentioned that your dad was perfectly cool with, you're doing literature. And I'm just thinking that had you been a boy, it may not have been that way because expectations are often kind of different. And
Well, I don't think we had very many expectations of my brother either. He did accountancy, but I think, to be honest, I don't really know because I was very young when he made that decision because he's much older than me. But I don't really think there was much pressure on him either. I don't think, my parents were not really that motivated by money and, the whole commercial aspect so much. So I think they were okay with it.
And what was your sort of sense of self, as it were? Like, what did you want to be? How did you see yourself at that time?
It's very strange you ask that, because I really had no clue when I was studying in college what I wanted to do. For me, it was just enough to be in college and studying literature, which I really loved. And I used to, spend all my time in the library. I was one of those really nerdy, kids who would probably annoy me now if I actually met her. But I used to be really nerdy. And I remember in my library, there used to be this one particular row of tables which had these big picture windows. And my biggest memory of college is sitting in that picture window and doing my research and, looking up literary criticism and all of that. And I never ever thought of what I was going to do next. And then suddenly I was in my third year of college and I had no idea what I wanted to do. The only thing I knew is I didn't want to be a teacher, because that was one thing that did not appeal to me at all. And I knew that I didn't want to do my MA, that I was happy because once I started studying literature, I realized that in a way it was a mistake, because once you start studying a subject, it loses a little bit of its charm because it becomes work. And I often felt that maybe I should have studied history and kept literature as something that, I enjoyed. And I didn't want to do my MA in literature or anything, so that I had to decide what I wanted to do. And the only thing I could think of was sitting for the civil services exam. So without any thought or whatever, after I finished my third year of college, I came to Delhi. Live with my uncle who used to live in Delhi, and so I sat for my prelims, and I never thought very much about it, and I did them and went back to Calcutta. And while after my prelims are done, and I had a little bit of time, and I just saw this ad in the newspaper. We used to get the Statesman, or was it the Telegraph in those days? May have been the Telegraph, about Sunday magazine looking for interns. And I wasn't doing anything.
Which year would this have been?
This was 87. And so I sent off an application saying that, okay, until my results come out, let me just do this. So I sent off an application and they asked me to come, and then I had to give a written test. And then I was invited back for an interview by Sunday. And so the two people interviewing me was Avik Sarkar, and there was another gentleman who was the editor of Sunday. And so I did the interview, and much to my surprise, I got the job. So there were two of us who were hired from this huge intake. And so I was in two minds. I should take it up or should I not take it up? And I said, anyway, it doesn't matter. Like, I have till the mains, I can study alongside. And I took up this job and I joined Sunday. And I used to be like the lowest of the low, the kind of person who'd be sent to the library to find pictures and, PTS se pull layout, that kind of little things. Then slowly, after about a week or so, they started giving me a little copy to edit and things like that. And then after some time, there was some telex that had come and it said something, this story has to be done this, and it was signed Veer. And I turned to Aditi, who was like the person who was mentoring me, and I said, who is this Veer? She said, you don't know who Veer is? That's the editor. It's Veer Sangvi. Didn't he interview you? So I said, oh shit, I thought that was Shubhabrata Bhattacharya. So all through my interview, I was interviewed by Veer and Avik, but I thought he was Shubhabrata Bhattacharya. So I'm very lucky I didn't call him Mr. Bhattacharya. And it took me like 2 weeks into Sunday to figure out who he was, which shows you how unprepared I was for the world of journalism or whatever.
Had you called him Mr. Bhattacharya, would you have gotten the job?
Probably not.
Then the whole future is different, right?
Probably not. So anyway, and I started working, and then once you start editing, then it was a small kind of office and there were very few of us. So you ended up getting assignments like go and do this little story, like, some quizzes happening somewhere, or, chota mota stories. And after I started doing that, I suddenly got into the whole, thing about journalism. I started enjoying myself. I started enjoying writing and started enjoying rewriting also, which is quite something because it was not something that most people like. And then anyway, I got through my prelims, and then I came back and I did my mains, and I got through my mains, and then I had to make a decision as to what I want to do, because I said, okay, now let me see. Now that I've got through, let me see. I'll go back for the interview. So I went back for the interview and I got through that as well. So then I had to decide, now what do I do?
So what you got through the
I got through the civil
what was your
services.
rank?
Gosh, I don't remember, but I don't remember really.
Wow.
It was like a lifetime ago. So then I had to decide what I wanted to do. So then I had a lot of, heart to hearts with my friends and my parents and everybody. And there were all these pros and cons, how people are, government job hai, you should take it, your life is made. How can you give it up for being like one lowly reporter or a lowly sub-editor on Sunday? But I don't know what prompted me, but I decided not to take it up and I decided to stay on in Sunday. Then after a while, when I was working in Sunday, I got a letter from the cabinet secretariat saying that we've seen that you passed the civil services and we'd like to offer you a job. And will you come for an interview to Delhi? And I was so naive, I didn't even know what the cabinet secretariat was or that it stood for RAW or whatever. So I showed it to various people in the office and they said, that's RAW. So you should definitely go for the interview, at least see what it's about. It's an experience. So I came back to Delhi for that and I gave the RAW interview. And it was the most surreal experience of my life. It was like this whole phalanx of men sitting like, silhouetted against a window like you see in all the John le Carre novels, asking all kinds of strange questions. And most of them had to do with politics. What do you think of the anti-defamation law and the Punjab agitation and the Sri Lanka thing, all the hot topics of that day. And then I got through that. And then they called me for a medical exam, at which point I finally pulled the plug and I said, I'm not joining RAW. And I decided to stay on with Sunday. But I often wonder that if I had joined RAW and become a spy, how wonderful it would be.
You could write a book about it.
I am writing a spy novel. I'm writing a spy novel. But, like my Veer's theory is that I was actually hired by RAW and I was sent as an undercover agent to Sunday.
That is
I wish.
a good
wish.
theory. Deeply embedded to spy on Veer Sanghvi.
and on the country,
Yeah.
Yeah, because I used to do political journalism in those days.
There you go.
So interviewing all prime ministers and, leaders of the opposition and stuff like that. It's a good way to report back to your handler. But unfortunately, that's not true. I would have liked to have two salaries, but it never happened.
And I'm just thinking that, every time you kept saying that I went for this mains or I went for interview or I went to the RAW interview, and I'm waiting for the point where you say that I didn't get through, but you got through all of them.
I got through all of them, yeah.
And I'm just thinking that must have done such wonders for your confidence, because one thing that I notice in not just young women today, but frankly, women of all ages, is this lack of self-belief, the imposter syndrome, as it were.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that in the 80s, it must have been even worse, finding that self-confidence where you just have many more men around you.
I don't know what it was. But I've never ever felt that lack of confidence. In fact, according to Veer, I was obnoxious at the interview and treated him and Avik Sakal like they were like misguided old people.
Wow.
But I think it's the arrogance of youth that you feel you can do anything. I would have more self-doubt because I know all the various things that go wrong. But when you're that young and you haven't really seen the world or whatever, you feel you can do anything. So it's a kind of a superpower almost, the arrogance of youth. And that's what carried me through. And also I think it mattered that I didn't really care deeply about these things, like when you care a lot, then you probably mess up a little bit because you're so nervous and, whatever. But I went into it like a lark, especially the RAW interview. I definitely went into it for a lark because I didn't really, want to join or whatever. In fact, it's the funniest thing because some people from IB who came to do my due diligence and, security check in Sunday, they came and told Veer, you should advise her not to join RAW. It's not a good place to be.
Wow.
So one government agency was running down the other. But I think it's also because I didn't really care that much. If I had really been invested in it, then maybe I would have been a little more nervous, but I wasn't.
And did you think of yourself as someone who likes to write, who wants to be a writer before all of this? Because you were such a voracious reader, you did study literature.
I did want to be a writer, that's true, but I never really thought of journalism. Somehow journalism was not something I grew up wanting to do. It was a complete accident, but I realized very soon after I joined that I enjoyed doing that. And when I had to make a decision between doing something I enjoyed doing and doing something that would probably pay me better at that point and would probably give me more prestige and, all of that, I think I went with the writing part because that's what I enjoyed doing. And I thought I would end up doing better at it as I went along. And I was very lucky because because we were a very young organization and we were a very small organization, we got opportunities that people probably wouldn't get for another 10 years of their career. Like, I joined in 87, and by 89, I was covering the general election. I was traveling with politicians to their constituencies. I was, covering rallies. Then I covered the first day of VP Singh's joining his when he became prime minister. I covered that with Chandrasekhar. I remember going on Chandrasekhar's plane once, accompanying him somewhere. And for somebody who's just out of college, that's such a huge opportunity. Like, I was basically, 24, 25 by then, and I was getting these enormous opportunities, to do this kind of thing. So when you have that kind of a future opening up in front of you, then the IFS or the IAS or IPS or whatever doesn't sound very exciting because you're still very much a lowly bot once you're starting out, whereas this was giving you an opportunity to meet people. I remember when I was still like maybe 25 or whatever, I went and met Vajpayee. He wasn't prime minister then. We were doing a story on poet politicians, and I went and interviewed him. And like you were saying about the pauses, remember before we started, and I would ask him a question, and then he would say a couple of sentences, and then he would pause, and then there would be this long silence. And I would think, now should I ask the next question? And just as I started, he would then start off again answering the previous one. And I was like really freaked out as to how this was playing out. But in fact, I remember when I went to interview him, I had gone from my office in PTI building to his Raisina, I think he was on Raisina Road in those days. And it started pouring. And by the time I got out of the three-wheeler and went into his car, I was drenched completely. So the moment I went inside, Mrs. Call was there and she saw me and she said, "Oh my God, tum to puri bheeg gayi hu." And she got me towels and then she got me tea and then she sat me down and she was like so motherly and kind of made sure that I was okay before I started the interview. So I had these really lovely experiences with people, in those days. And when you're young and you have this sort of, world opening up before you, you can't think of giving that up, to do something so boring as to sit in a office and just push pens. You don't want to do that.
And I had a similar stroke of good luck in the early 2000s when I was also in my 20s. And online sports journalism had just started. So I worked first for Wisden.com and then for Cricinfo. And there were a bunch of us young people, Rahul Bhattacharya, me, later on Siddharth Vaidyanathan, all big names now except me. And what we would, and I realized that wherever we went to cover test matches, and we would cover, straight away we were covering test matches. And all these older fogies would look at us with so much resentment.
Exactly.
And later one of them took me aside and he said, Amit, I think he was from one of the news agencies. And he said, let me tell you how it is. I started in Times of India. Today I'm here. In Times of India, it got me 4 years to get to cricket. And I was allowed then to go to college cricket and, I got my first Ranji Trophy game after 8 years in the thing.
Wow.
I got my first test match after 20 years in the profession.
Can you imagine?
और आप बच्चे हो, आप आ गए, आप सीधा टेस्ट मैच में हमारे साथ बैठ रहे हो. You can also, so he was very honest about it, but the others weren't. And I of course also had the arrogance of youth, and sometimes it helps when you're really bad but you think you're really good, because then you fake it till you make it, in a sense. And I think that's what I did. And what I want to ask you about is then also that process of learning about two important things in journalism. One is just the writing itself. Like, who were you writing and reporting? Like, were there any writing or reporting tours, so to say? How did you kind of figure that stuff out? Because as a young person looking at myself, I would try too hard. I would want to show off my facility with the language, do fancy things and all of that. And gradually over time, that gets beaten out of you and you learn what not to do. So, I want to understand that process of learning about writing and reporting. And also, the process of learning basic journalistic values, because it strikes me that abroad people will go to Columbia Journalism School, or they'll go to some journalism school, and even within institutions there are uh, there are sets of values which are embedded. But from what I remember of the little that I've seen of Indian journalism back in the day, it was very haphazard. If you were lucky, you got a good editor who would teach you a lot, but otherwise, you would be thrown into the thick of things. You just had to produce a lot of copy, and you weren't really learning much either in terms of writing or in terms of values. So what was that learning process for you?
For me, it was different because I actually joined a desk. So I wasn't really a reporter. I started off as a trainee sub editor. So I was under training. I was on probation for like 6 months or whatever. And I spent, so we used to do reporting on the side. Like that was a treat for us. Like, you would get assigned a story to do, and it was something that you did because you were so excited about it. Your basic job was to sit and rewrite copy that came from the Delhi bureau or the Bombay bureau or whatever. And of course, you didn't get to rewrite right away because you had to learn how to do it. But I actually enjoyed the rewriting because I felt that, um, again, arrogance of youth, that I was improving copy. And honestly speaking, some of the copy was pretty bad. And the good thing about studying literature at Loreto is that they taught you how to write. So at least you knew basic grammar, and you knew basic things of how you wanted to do it. But the training of how to put a new story together and how to do this, that came on the job, because I didn't do any journalistic training whatsoever. I learned everything on the job, even learning how to sub, how to put in, those stet symbols and all of that. I learned on the job. I had no idea what I was getting into. But I had, the person I used to report to immediately was Chitrita Banerjee, who's now a food writer who writes these food books and stuff. And she used to kind of help us and teach us various things. And then Veer, of course, was the editor, but he was too busy to do like proper training. But once you had edited a story, and especially the bigger stories, then they would go to him, and then he would tell you what was wrong and what was right and what it should be. And like you said, all your adjectives are thrown out, and you have to pare down your writing and be like whatever. And also in those days, there used to be these very itty bitty gossipy pieces that used to go on, I forget what was called, Delhi Diary or something. And that actually was a good training ground to learn how to write, because it had to be pithy, it had to be witty, it had to have information, and it had to be like 250 words. So that was good training for us, because you would just get this information from the Delhi bureau, that this, it was basically a gossip column, ye ho raha hai, wo ho raha hai, and then you put it together somehow into a little thing. And there were no bylines, so there was no pressure that people were going to judge you by what you had written. So that was good training. And then in the back of the book, we had book reviews and we had stuff like that. So we actually got to do a lot of different things. Like, there was a business section, so we'd edit business copy as well. So it actually trained us a lot. Like, for instance, I remember I was working on this cover story on this whole Harshad Mehta, whatever thingy. And in just working on that story, I learned so much about the stock exchange, which I promptly forgot 2 months later, but that's a different story. But every story just taught you so much, So it was a really good training ground. And you learned essential skills, like, what should the first para of a story be? It should be something that draws you in. It has to have at least 3 bits of information which power it through. You can't end in the middle. You have to have a rounded, thing at the end of your story. So the beginning and the end of your story have to be really strong. And then you work on the middle. So we learn these essential skills. And then I think it's just a question of whether you're good at it or bad at it. You can't really train somebody who is not a good writer to be a good writer. You can train them to be a competent writer. But I think writing is something that's either innate, or you have to have a gift. I don't think a competent writer can be trained, but to be a really good writer, I don't think you can train that.
Prem Panikar, who I mentioned a while back, once lamented about journalism that as budgets are falling, what is happening is that you have less and less journalists in the newsrooms having to churn out more and more stories in terms of, per capita output, as it were. And the result is that a lot of news is like a mile wide and an inch deep. And one of the dangers of that is that journalists have become generalists, right? And I'm reminded of, I mean, there are two places I'm going with this. One is this phenomenon known as Gell-Mann amnesia. Have you heard of it?
No.
So Gell-Mann amnesia is Murray Gell-Mann, a famous physicist, had once pointed something out to Michael Crichton, who later called it Gell-Mann amnesia and wrote about it. And it basically is that you'll read something in a newspaper on a subject you know about deeply, and you'll realize it's rubbish. They know nothing. But you'll trust it on every other subject,
That's so true.
even though they got your subject wrong. And one reason for that, obviously, is that a newspaper, especially in India, where a journalist is expected to do one or two stories a day, often in some newsrooms, and the specialist beats are disappearing. You could be doing going from one subject to the other, that a journalist covering of any subject will be so incredibly shallow that any specialist in the field will obviously know what the hell is this. And I'm thinking that for you in a magazine, it must have therefore been an advantage that you don't have that kind of quantity pressure, right? That you have to produce 1-2 stories a day.
No.
So if you're doing a Harshad Mehta story,
You can spend 3 weeks on it.
you can really grok the subject and understand the stock market.
And also, in a newspaper, there is a lot of pressure because you still have to fill that front page every single day. Whereas in a magazine, it was a weekly magazine, so it wasn't like a monthly. So there was still some pressure. I mean, we still pulled all-nighters and stuff like that, putting it to bed. So that was there, but it wasn't like a newspaper in that sense. And also, we were lucky because we had bureaus, who could report back to us and stuff. Now, but I don't know, newspapers don't really have staff any longer. There's hardly anybody on the desk. There's hardly anybody in the bureaus. So half of them are relying on PTI copy or, that kind of thing. So we were lucky because people put resources into reporting. Like, I remember we used to have this lady who worked with us, Shiraz Sidhwa, who used to cover Kashmir and stuff. And I lost count of the number of times that we actually sent her to Kashmir to do stories. It wasn't like we were relying on some stringer to just, file and copy and just do it. And all of that took money, and we were willing to spend that money, to do that. Now, journalism just doesn't have that. Either they don't have the resources, or they don't have the will, or they don't have the inclination. I don't know what it is.
And also, I'm thinking that because of the way in which we consume information and the way we consume news has changed, something else has also changed in the way that it is presented to us. For example, I remember in the 80s and 90s, I loved reading Sunday. I don't specifically remember reading your byline in those days, but I would love Wade's editorials. I thought they were so sharp and crisp and well written and insightful. And what great editors tend to do, whether it's Veer in Sunday or my friend Sambit Bal in Gentleman at one point in time, or perhaps Vinod Mehta in any of the places he was at certain stints, not always. What great editors tend to be is also they tend to be great curators. It is as if they are telling you, this is what is important about the world. I am presenting it to you in one package. And that package is this magazine called Sunday, or is this magazine called Gentleman, or whatever it is. And it's an invaluable function. And we would go out there and we would buy that package, and we would know that, there is a sensibility and a perspective that has shaped this package, and we can trust it. And I just realized I haven't probably bought a magazine in 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, me neither.
I consume everything online. I'm clicking on links. So I might read a piece in whatever Sunday's equivalent today would be, but I would read a piece, and the curators of today are perhaps cultural curators, maybe in some default way, even me, because people say that, they'll follow all my guests and they'll look at the show notes and all of that. But the world is more complex than ever. We are dazzled by the amount of data that's available out there. And perhaps we look at influencers as a certain kind of curator, or we look at whatever we have made out of our Twitter feed as a kind of curation.
True.
But I'm feeling that role, in a sense, which a great editor would play, and you've been an editor yourself as well, is perhaps lost.
Yeah.
What's your sense of that?
I mean, it's probably probably overstating the case, but there aren't that many great editors left, are there? I mean, I can't think offhand of anybody. An editor also is, in a sense, a talent spotter.
Yeah.
Like you want to do something on the film industry. You think of the best person who can do that piece, and you hire that person, you brief that person, and you get the best piece out of that person. An editor is not necessarily somebody who understands every single subject, but knows what he wants out of it. And I think that skill is lost, that skill of just kind of spreading your net far and wide. Like if you're doing business reporting, going to the best possible person to get it. If you're saying reviewing a book on politics, finding the best possible person who has, like, domain knowledge to actually write about that book. I think that is disappearing because I don't see that anymore, really.
And I guess it's natural for that to disappear because that particular package called
Mhm.
A magazine or A
It's gone,
whatever
yeah.
is disappearing itself. So you might have individual talents striking out. Like I remember the editor I was fortunate to work with in my early days, Sambit Bal. One thing that I amazed me about him, and he was of course in the world of features, so kind of different world from You for Gentleman and then Wisdom and then Crick Info, where he still is. And he was like a magnet for young talent. And he would nurture them so beautifully,
Yeah.
he would not.
See, that's the other thing. An editor needs to have so much self confidence. But so many people these days feel threatened by younger people who are talented. But an editor needs to have that confidence to be able to give the other person space. Like, I find it so strange, when senior people want to hog bylines. I mean, you should give bylines to younger people. They're the ones who are starting out. They're the ones to whom it means so much. I mean, I remember starting out, and when I went and interviewed Chandrasekhar, for instance, on his first day at PM, and Ananda Bazar Patrika, they asked me to file, and they translated into Bengali because I don't really write Bengali. And I got a front page byline on Ananda Bazar Patrika. I still remember the thrill I felt, as a young person, even though I wasn't really a Bengali speaker or whatever, and I couldn't really understand, but it was a big deal for me. Whereas when you're in your 50s or whatever, I mean, it's old hat. You don't really need a byline to prove anything to yourself. You should give it to young people and let them enjoy that moment and, feel. But very few people have that generosity of spirit to do it. It's quite sad.
And the second part of my question about your learning process, one was, of course, about writing and reporting, and you've spoken about how so much of that was on the job, being thrown into the thick of
Yeah.
things, working with good people. But the second part was really, in a sense, about the values. That how do I approach a story? What are the areas to get into? What are my ethics while I'm doing this? Is there sort of a higher purpose? Because I am constantly conflicted into different directions when I think about journalism. That on the one hand, I like to think of there being a set of values that are dear to me. That one, of course, the pursuit of truth is above all else. But whether you are sort of afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted, or you're speaking truth to power, any of those cliches, that there is this sense that there is a higher calling, that there is a sacredness that I cannot compromise, right? But at the same time, there is the understanding that this is also a business venture, and I consider business ventures to be entirely honorable. The pursuit of profit is deeply honorable to me, because the only way you can make profit is by making someone else better off in a free market. So I'm not sort of going on an anti-profit or anti-capitalist rant. I am a committed capitalist, and there the imperative is that, look, people have invested money. At the end of the day, every publication or whatever, it has a responsibility to its shareholders as well. And that also becomes important. And then that incentive or imperative can also shape the kind of stories that you do. And the waters get muddied where, in India, for example, pretty much every mainstream publication has other business interests. No one is just a newspaper. There could be a big newspaper, but the owner of the newspaper could also own chemical factories, and the government could set the ED on them the next day. So there are all those pressures to contend with. So then, as a journalist, what was your sense of values? Like, what was the evolution of your sense of values? Like, if you were to define, say, your duty as a journalist, how do you define it? Is it a duty to a story? Or as an editor, it's a much broader thing. You're not only doing a story, you're choosing what to cover and who to cover it with.
Like you said about newspapers having different interests, I was very lucky that I worked for Anand Bazar Patrika because they don't have any other businesses. So there weren't the pressures that you talk about, or, I'm sure there were pressures. I'm sure that people did put pressure on them, but they were not so compromised in that sense. And in all my years of working for Sunday and then for Telegraph, I cannot remember a single instance when Avik Sarkar would call me up and ask me, A, what story I was doing, or two, not to do the story. Never happened. And there was never any story I filed that never got used because he was scared of, what the repercussions would be or whatever. So I think I was very privileged in that sense. Most people don't have that privilege. They have all kinds of pressures operating on them, which both you and I know what the pressures are. So I was lucky in that sense that I didn't have that. But I think when you're talking about principles of journalism, I think your principal responsibility has to be to your reader. I think it's not to the story, it's not to the publication, it has to be to your reader, because you owe your reader the truth. No matter what the story is, it could be the story about a design collection or a fashion show, could be a story about a restaurant opening, it could be a story about parliamentary proceedings, it could be a story about the launch of a new car. It doesn't matter what the story is. I think what you owe your reader is the truth. And if you can't give him the truth, then it's better you not do the story at all. Because it's no point doing a story if you have to obfuscate about it. I think that is the guiding principle as far as I am concerned. That if you can't tell the truth, then don't do it. It's no point.
And as an editor, it's not just about telling the truth. Let's say you can tell the truth about any story that you choose to tell, but you have limited space and you choose a limited set of stories. And the danger is that if you are constantly guided by what the reader already wants, or what you think he already wants, or what your market research indicates he already wants, then everybody's in a race to the bottom, in a sense. Then you give Bollywood and cricket and all of that.
No, I don't think you give the reader what he wants. You give the reader the truth, but it's not necessarily what he's asking for, because the reader will read what you give him. I don't You have to decide to shape your readership. You can't just blindly give whatever. Like, if there are three magazines in the market and two of them are doing the same kind of stories, you don't necessarily have to be the third one doing the same kind of story. You can do something different. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but you have to have some confidence in your own judgment that this is what is important. You can't really, I mean, just rely on, like you said, the lowest common denominator and do it. Like, if you were to do a Bollywood story, it would sell, but you can't keep doing Bollywood stories every single time you do a cover story. You have to kind of, go beyond that. I mean, that's, I think, one of the problems with the way the fashion magazines function, for instance. No matter what happens, there's a film star on the cover. So, I find it a bit strange.
So tell me about it's almost as if in your journalistic career you were, before you could think, you're thrown into the middle of things. You're in a newsroom, then you get to do
Yeah.
a story once in a while, and then suddenly you're out doing political reportage.
Yeah.
You're meeting Vajpayee and taking in
Yeah.
his long pauses. You're meeting all
Yeah.
of these. So what was that journey like, and as that journey happened, what did you learn about the kind of work you wanted to do?
You know, the one thing I was always sure was I didn't want to just write about politics. I wanted to write about more than politics, because beyond a point, all political stories are a little bit the same. I mean, then there's not much to do about it. And daily political reportage never excited me in the same way, like, going and attending a BJP press conference at the end, up to in the days when there were BJP press conferences every day, up to khair, there are no press conferences only. But in the old days, there used to be this, tradition of political parties holding conferences for beat reporters, and then they're coming back and writing it over. I mean, that kind of writing was fine as a starting out point, but it didn't excite me that much. Like, I always wanted to do profiles on people. I wanted to spend time with them, try and understand their, where they're coming from. It could be politicians, it could be a film star, it could be a business executive, but I was interested by people journalism because I found that really interesting. Like, I remember spending time with Uma Bharti, in the days when, she was a very different person. She had just come into the limelight, and I remember spending a couple of days with her in Delhi, and she was such a bubbly and sweet person. And then she would, I remember one instance particularly, I went and saw her in her flat, somewhere around Three Murti Road or somewhere, and she saw me and she dragged me in front of the mirror and said, देखो हम बिल्कुल बहनें लगती हैं ना. So I said, yeah. As a journalist, you said, yeah, do everything to make sure that people think.
But did you look like Behne?
I don't think so. But she thought so. And then she showed me her doll collection. I mean, would you think that Uma Bharti had a doll collection?
That's so endearing. That's such a lovely detail, actually.
Yeah. And then I went and traveled with her to Madhya Pradesh. I covered a rally. And I like doing stories like that, where you could actually spend time with people. And in Sunday, we still had long form journalism. So you could do like, lengthy profiles, just, examining what people were like. It's not that you had to put it in like 550 words and, do it, which is what it is now. So I enjoyed doing things like that. I did a lot of film journalism as well in those days. That was the time that Anil Kapoor was emerging as the big hero, and we did a whole cover story on whether he would take over from Amitabh Bachchan. Of course, we all know how that turned out, but it was a good fun. I went and spent time on the sets of Tridev, and I met all the producers and the distributors, and so we did all these deep dives into subjects like that. And and then during the general election, I remember the first general 89, the first one that I covered, we did a whole story on Maharajas on the campaign trail. So we covered Bhavani Singh in Jaipur, and we covered Pataudi in Bhopal, and we covered Vasundhara Raje, and so we did all these, the royals on the campaign trail kind of story. And Nitin Rai was a photographer in those days, Raghu Rai's son, and Nitin and I were in this Khatara ambassador, going from place to place, driving around, following these people around. We spent like 2 weeks on the road researching the story. So those were the stories that I really enjoyed doing, and which I still think back to, with some nostalgia. But the normal bread and butter stories don't really live with you. They are like something you do and then you forget about it and move on.
I mean, traveling in Khatara Jeep sounds like, were those the best days of your life when you look back?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I like to think the best days are yet to come.
I hope so. I hope so. Did you write about Uma Bharti's dolls?
I think I did. The worst part of it is, the Anand Bazar library burnt down? Don't you?
No, I didn't.
So there was this huge, while I was still working with Telegraph, one day I went to the office and the whole street was blocked off and the entire building was on fire. And by fire, I mean like proper, flames bursting out. So the entire library was destroyed, and they've had to somehow, restore it digitally. So I don't even know if those stories exist anymore, because I never kept any clippings. So I'll have to find out if they still exist. But I remember doing the story, so definitely.
That's a great tragedy. I wonder how much old Sundays would
Yeah,
sell for.
yeah.
I mean, I used to love your political
Yeah,
coverage
yeah.
of the
I don't know
of the
how
magazine.
I don't know how they would have restored it. Maybe they went to other people and tried to get or whatever. But it used to be a really good library which had every clipping you wanted and really well done. We used to have this really good librarian called Shakti Roy, who used to run it like a little dictator, and it all went up in smoke. Literally, it's really distressing.
Something else I want to know about, when you said that when you started right at the very start, you were the person that sent to the library to get a clip or whatever. And I'm just thinking of like how I research for an episode today is I can really do it sitting on my computer. That I can read every book the person has written. I can read every article they have written. I can see all the YouTube interviews. I can just do it all here, sitting here, one person, no assistant required. And I can type everything myself, and like everything is computer. But I remember even back in the day, like when I was in advertising in the 90s, for example, or in television, and our technology was so outdated, a laptop would seem such a glamorous thing to me from a distance. Like I really wanted to own my own laptop. It was such a dream in the 90s, right?
Yeah.
If you want to write. And tell me a little bit about those sort of processes, like what would a typical day be like? Because if you are being sent to interview someone, you do not have the internet. How do you
How
do
do you
your
research?
research? How
Yeah.
do you even know what they look like? How do you
Yeah.
get hold of a
Yeah.
book they have written? What I
Yeah,
mean, I
it's
would
tough.
imagine. So what was that process
You
like?
know, in fact, when I started off in Sunday, we used to work on typewriters. It was not even, we didn't even have those old fashioned, it's only like 2 years into working into Sunday that we started getting into those little computers which used to work with that floppy disk. And
That
do you
big
remember?
black
Yeah,
floppy
big,
disk,
big
yeah.
floppy disk. And I actually learned typing on the job. I didn't really know how to type or anything. It was literally two fingers. But, the process was so different. Like I remember in those days, like when I just joined Sunday, being sent off to interview PC Sarkar. And as you said, there was you know, no way to research it except for the library. So you had to go to the library, look at old clips, maybe talk to a few people on the staff, the older members who maybe had some, memories of him, or somebody who had seen a show or whatever. And I remember going to interview him, and I was made to sit in this waiting room, while he was inside. And he had this rope that was like literally horizontal, and I don't know how it kept upright. And I tried to figure it out. I went close by, and it was nothing was holding it up, but it stayed upright. It was probably one magic trick of his or something. And he was like the most amazing man. But like you said, I had no context for him. I hadn't even seen one of his shows, so it's not like I went and saw a show after I interviewed him. But we're very lucky now. I don't know how we functioned in those days. Like even when it came to political reporting, like if I interviewed Uma Bharti or whatever, I had no context for her. I had to talk to other people in the BJP to get some, inputs on her. Then we used to have a sister publication called Ravivar, which was a Hindi publication. So they had a lot of reporters from, Madhya Pradesh or Uttar Pradesh or whatever. So if you were interviewing somebody from that milieu, you went and chatted with them. Rajiv Shukla used to be a big resource for us in those days. He used to work for Ravivar and then started writing for Sunday. And he was very clued in this whole, Hindi belt universe. So anytime we wanted information, we would call him up, and there were no mobile phones. So you had to call up the office, and then you had to find out when Raji would be there. Then he would wander into office, and if he felt like it, he would call you back. And if he didn't, he wouldn't. So it was tough, actually, the kind of stuff that we had to do, the kind of running around. And for every story you did, you had to interview like at least 5 or 6 ancillary people to just get information. And we never did those interviews on the phone either. We always went and met people.
And I can imagine the pros and the cons. And the cons, of course, are that it's much easier to get much more dope today. So today, if I interview someone, I have much more knowledge about them than I could possibly have. But the pros of doing it in that old school way is that you are much more engaged in the research work that you are
Yeah.
putting in. You're having conversations with people about those people. You're
Hmm.
kind of doing all of that. And I wonder if an analog to that is a process of writing itself.
Yeah.
Like something my students will often tell me is, how should I write? Should I do it on the computer or should I do it by hand? And I just think that, like, number one, the obvious answer that comes to me is that words are words, whatever you're comfortable with. But if you think a little deeper, there is a difference. That when I'm writing into a physical notepad with a pen, because it is slower, I am forced to be a little more deliberate and deliberative and to think harder about what I am doing. And if I look at the transitional phase where you're doing it into a physical typewriter, which I have used for a very brief while, there is no backspace in whatever. You have to do a full page all over again.
Yeah.
So you really need to have that certainty about
Yeah.
your words and a ठहराव in your thinking. Whereas on the computer, I can do whatever. I know there's a
Yeah.
backspace and all of that. And how have your habits evolved? And do you feel it's kind of changed in the way that you work and perhaps the way that you think? Have you?
It's strange you should say that, because when I started out writing, I could only write longhand. I even if I had to write a story, I would write it longhand and then I would type it on my typewriter. I never typed it. But over the years, I find it more easy writing on a laptop. I just somehow that discipline of writing by hand I seem to have lost. Now when I try to write by hand, either my handwriting goes awry or I miss out on words or something like that. Whereas if I write on the computer, thoughts come more easily to me. I think I made that transition in my head. Like, for instance, now, even when it comes to reading news stories, like, I would much rather read the New York Times on my phone than read the HD in a print edition. I don't know why. I just find it much easier.
I recorded yesterday with a philosopher, writer, triathlete called Akash Singh Rathore,
Hmm.
and he told me about this Norwegian writer who's a friend of his called Torkel Brekke, and he came across, I think, Brekke's sixth book or seventh book called Foundations, and he thought, hey, I've read everything by this guy, but the prose is so different. What the hell happened? You know, the sentences are shorter, it's just full of life, there's momentum, everything is charging forward. So he sent an email to Torkel saying, you know, what's the deal? What did you do? And his friend sends him back a photograph which is of a treadmill desk. So he has a treadmill and he's attached a desk at the end of it,
Wow.
and he's literally typing while walking.
And that's changed his
And
entire
that's changed his style. And I'm presuming that that change between his walking and the language must also have changed
his
in
brain. Yeah.
his brain and the way he's thinking.
I
in
don't think I
between.
could do that. I can't walk and write at the same time. No, I have to concentrate on the write.
So I have a sit stand desk at home, but I don't use it to stand. It's one of those automatic things. You press a button, it goes all the way. But I don't use it to actually stand and write. What I use it for in my lazy Bengali way is that I will sit in different angles of slouch and I will adjust it to the angle of slouch. On that note of slouching, let's take a quick commercial break and
Okay.
let's continue at the other end of it.
Great.
Hey, the music started and this sounds like a commercial, but it isn't. It's a plea from me to check out my latest labor of love, a YouTube show I am co-hosting with my good friend, the brilliant Ajay Shah. We've called it Everything is Everything. Every week, we'll speak for about an hour on things we care about, from the profound to the profane, from the exalted to the everyday. We range widely across subjects and we bring multiple frames with which we try to understand the world. Please join us on our journey and please support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. The show is called Everything is Everything. Please do check it out.
Welcome back to the Seen and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Seema Goswami, who's just delighting me with her extreme candor. And, you know, in the break, we were talking about how long we want to live. And I was telling you that, you know, there are friends of mine who, inspired by the likes of David Sinclair and Peter Attia, keep telling me that, hey, we will live till 120. And my initial reaction would be, I do not want that.
I don't want that at all.
But then, you know, one concept they keep coming up with is like, there's a term lifespan. Now, I heard this recent interview of Peter Attia. I think it's either on the Shane Parrish show or one of these podcasts. I'll link it from the show notes, where he introduced me to the term health span.
Yeah, I've read that. Yeah.
Health span is how long you're healthy. And my scene is, I don't really care about the lifespan bit because I don't want like 50 years of dementia. Like, that's horrible. That's a nightmare. But the health span thing, I can live with. Though having said that, every once in a while in my morose way, I'll wondering, Jeena kyu, kis liye, kya hai, you know, khatam karo is natak ko. But as, you know, I'm almost 50 and you're in your 50s and, you know, reaching here, how has the way you look at time sort of changed? Because I remember when I was 20, 40 seemed almost old to me. I wanted immediate gratification. I wanted to be world famous by 25, Booker Prize by 28, all of that rubbish. And of course, part of sort of maturing and adulting, you kind of realize that A, lot of your dreams are not going to come true, but B, a lot of them were the wrong dreams to have anyway. And you kind of adjust the way you think about the world, but also the way you think about time changes.
Yeah.
Right? Like right now, I am further away from my birth than my birth was from, say, the Second World War. Right? Those two are much closer. And, you know, earlier we would read about something that happened 100 years ago and it would seem like incredibly distant. But suddenly you're at 50. It feels like decades have just passed.
Yeah,
A friend of mine likes to say that the days are long, but the years are short.
Short, yes, absolutely.
And how has the way that you look at yourself through this prism of time kind of changed? Like, you know, the youthful you would have visualized one kind of life for yourself. Like, what was that like? How has that changed?
You know, it's funny you say that because I was just watching a TV show the other day, which was set in the 1970s. And I was thinking how strange it is to have a period show of an of a period I actually lived through.
Yeah.
Because in my mind, period shows about the 1920s and 1930s or whatever. But this was a period show of the 1970s and sometimes even the 80s, in which I was already like in class 10 or whatever. But, when growing up, how I visualize my life, to be honest, I had very little clue of what my life was going to be like when I was 50 or whatever. I never really thought about it. I really I actually lived for the moment. I never even thought about like I should save money and I should keep this aside, in case I grow old or whatever. I never thought of that. It was really a sort of a hedonistic existence where you just wanted to enjoy yourself. You wanted to go out with friends, go on holiday, have fun or whatever. But as I've grown older, I think time has kind of both slowed down and sped up in some ways. Like, for instance, during the lockdown, it was like almost 2 years of a solitary experience, just sitting at home and doing nothing. And time kind of expanded in that period. Every day seemed so long, you didn't know what to do with it. But in a sense, it was also great for me because I could concentrate on stuff. I could concentrate on my writing. There weren't too many distractions or whatever. And ever since we've come out of lockdown, I feel like I'm trying very hard to make up for lost time. Like, I didn't travel during that period. So now I'm traveling almost every month. I try and make a trip to kind of make up for it. And as you grow older, like I'm in my 50s, and I keep thinking, oh my God, there's so much of the world I haven't seen. I better do it in the next 10 years because after that, God knows I'm going to be in a wheelchair or something. So,
Come on.
but it's true because the older you grow, your energy levels go down, and you for instance, when you're young, you can do like 2-day trips and you can just do everything in those 2 days and come back and rejoin work and you're fine. But when you're older, you want one day to relax and one day to do stuff, and then you come back from holiday, you want one day to recover. So things change. So that, like I said, time both speeds up and slows down for you as you grow older. So it is different. And you also have this sense of time running out on you. You feel, okay, like at the moment, I'm working on a spy novel, which I should finish by the end of the year, hopefully. And I keep feeling, okay, like it'll come out next year. And then I have these 2 years to do another book. And how many books can I realistically do after that before my mind gives up on me? So you have those fears, that you fear that your mind will slow down, words don't come as easily. And, your imagination probably won't be as vivid as it was when you were young. So you have all these fears as you grow older.
You wrote this beautiful column on COVID, the ways in which they were good for you. And, the potted version of that is that one, you liked how your world shrank down to your core group. So casual acquaintances, distant
Yeah.
family members out of the window. It's, the people you really care about. And then when you're locked up in your homes, you have unlimited time to yourself, where a lot of outside distractions aren't there and you
Yeah.
can just spend time with yourself. You spoke about how you love going for walks in parks, and that was great during the lockdown
Yeah, there
because
was nobody around.
there was nobody around. And the charm of the road trip, and of course the air you got to breathe in Delhi, which is not something you can do anything about.
Yeah.
But all the other stuff was interesting to me because it was almost like this really weird circumstance which no one could have predicted. The circumstance of COVID and lockdowns suddenly got you, and I think a lot of people, including perhaps me to some extent, closer to discovering what was important for them, what was working for them, what was
Very
not
true.
working for them. And so I'll ask you a hypothetical question, which sometimes can do that. It's like my favorite party question, so people who've heard it before kindly excuse. But it's a two-part question, starting with one scenario. A comet is heading towards planet Earth. It is going to hit the Earth. We are all going to die. This is a given. There is scientific consensus. Everybody accepts it.
Yeah.
Everybody will cease to exist. So now there are two parts to the question. Part one is, if you have 24 hours to live, what would you do in that 24 hours?
Okay. What should I do in those 24 hours? Okay. So I know I'm going to die, right?
Everybody's going to die, not
Everybody's
just you.
gonna
And
die.
everybody knows it, and there's nothing that can be done.
Gosh. I think I may just go to bed.
You may just go to bed.
I don't think I'll be able to do anything. I'll be paralyzed by the thought of impending doom. What would you do?
No, I'll ask you first. I'll tell you my answers later.
Acha, okay,
But
I really don't know what I would do.
assume you can click out of this paralysis and you have 24 hours. And
Assume I can click out of the paralysis. Okay. I'll probably take my husband and go for a walk in Sundar Nursery and look at all the nice plants, have a cup of coffee, then have a nice meal maybe, call up my sister, make sure she's okay. I mean, basically speak to my family. That's it.
if you had 24 months,
24 months. My gosh, that's a long time.
that's the second question. If you had 24 months, what will you do?
If I knew a comet was coming in 24 months,
Yeah. But sharp, the date is decided. There's nothing that
I
can
would
be done.
spend all my money. I would travel around the world. I'll go to all the places I've not been to. And what if the comet doesn't come and I'm broke at the end of it and alive?
No, comet is coming.
Okay.
Everybody agrees.
Okay. So that's what I'll do. I'll travel across the world, me and my husband, go to all the places we've not been to, have the best of meals, drink champagne.
At what point does your 24-month plan become your 24-hour plan?
I don't know.
And the final question, what's in your case, you're probably living this life now, but what stops you from doing it now is the way I end the series of questions.
What stops you from doing it now? Work. I have to work. So does my husband. So we can't really take off.
And I'm guessing you go for walks in Sundar Nursery anyway.
Yeah. Though not with him so often. Mostly on my own. He comes very, very rarely. But yeah, you're right. Nothing is stopping me from doing it. Except I can't do it all the time. But if I had 1 year, then that's all I would do.
Because yeah, I was thinking about, what you mentioned about how COVID sort of concentrated your mind to, what was important. And there's another beautiful column where you've written about the flowers of Tokyo, and you have this para where you write, I remember coming back to India and writing a column bemoaning the fact that while we have plenty of flowering trees in India, Amaltas, Saptaparani, Tesu, Palash, to name just a few, which are just as pretty, we don't seem to make much of them. We didn't take time off to sit in parks or simply by the side of the road to admire their beauty. Stop quote. And you mentioned also that in the 24-hour scenario, when you went for a walk with your husband in Sundar Nursery, you would look at the plants and you would look at the flowers.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking that what happens through life, what has certainly happened to me, is that we grow much less mindful. That we could be eating a meal that we really wanted to eat, but after the first couple of bites, we are lost in our own head. We are not really tasting it.
I'm tasting it.
You are tasting it.
Oh, yeah.
So,
See, food is very important to me.
So I'll come to food, but my larger question before food is about mindfulness. That is that something that you have had to be intentional about? Because typically what happens is that everything is normalized. We are surrounded by beauty, we are surrounded by wonder, but we normalize it and we don't really, it just becomes part of the background. And at least in my case, I have to keep reminding myself that Amit, you fool, just snap out of that, your internal monologue and notice all these things around you. What has your journey been towards sort of?
It's interesting you say that because I remember going to Venice and being blown away by the beauty. And I thought to myself that people who live here all the time, do they actually appreciate it that much, or does it just become part of the normal scenery? When you're surrounded by it all the time, does it still seem special to you? But I find with me, it does still seem special. Like sometimes you're just driving around, like I drove down to your studio and I passed Masjid More, and then suddenly this old mosque came up out of nowhere. And it's beautiful. And it's just by the side of the road, no fanfare, no tourists, no nothing or whatever, but it's beautiful. So just driving through Delhi, if you just look up from your phone or whatever, you'll see Safdarjung's tomb on one side, you'll see these beautiful trees, tree-lined avenues on the other. If you're walking towards Nehru Park, you'll see this beautiful, greenery or whatever. I find I still appreciate that because for me, I count myself very lucky to live in this city because there are so many wonderful things that you can do for no money at all. You don't have to spend a truckload of money to go to Lodi Garden. Anybody can go there. It's not even like Sundar Nursery where you have to pay an entrance fee or whatever, which is like 40 rupees or something. But you can just go there, sit there, maybe listen to music, maybe read a book. I do that often, in the winter. I just take a book along and I can sit there and just, look around at the trees and listen to the birds and look at the things. And I find that if you open yourself up, there is beauty almost everywhere you look in this city. It's just that people complain so much about Delhi, that traffic is like this and the people are bad and ye hai or wo hai and all that. But if you really want to appreciate where you live, you just have to appreciate what is around you.
Let's talk about food now, because as you said, you're always sort of mindful about food, and about food. My thing again is that I certainly find myself like every minute of a meal I'm not focused on it. It might have been something I craved, something that I wanted. I might think about it in between, but 90% of the time I'm eating something, I'm not really thinking about it. And that is as someone who is eating food. And in your case, you've also written about food, and of course you're with Veer, so he's writing about food all the time. That's a whole game, and does that so incredibly well. And I guess his writing about food would increase his sort of conscious appreciation of nuances, which would be missing for, say, someone like me, right? And equally for you, therefore, there would be an intentionality in the kind of food that you eat, that you taste. So it's not just an exotic dish and you're thinking about the taste, you're thinking about other stuff associated with it, whether it's cultural or social, or these ingredients are so great, and etc., etc. Tell me a little bit about your relationship with food. Like, is your love for food one of the things that kind of you and Veer happen to have in common, or
When we met, he wasn't really into food writing.
oh really?
Food writing came, I mean, he used to do the occasional food writing, but he didn't do like a weekly column or whatever when he was in Sunday. In fact, he used to do food writing before he joined Sunday, when he was with Imprint, and he used to write for Independent. Was it Independent, or what was that Bombay newspaper? I've forgotten the name now.
There was one called Independent. I don't know if that's
Which one was the one that Vinod Mehta used to do?
Independent, as far as I
Yeah,
remember.
okay.
Oh,
So
there was Indian Post also
maybe
back
it
in the
was
day.
Indian Post. I can't remember. So I don't think we bonded over food or anything like that, because food was not that important. But when I say food is important to me, I don't mean in terms of going to expensive restaurants or eating exotic food or whatever. But it's very important to me that every meal should be a good meal. It doesn't have to be something exotic or whatever. Like, I can make a very simple dal, but it has to be a right dal. Like, it has to taste right. I can make a sabzi. I can just make a simple khichdi or whatever at home. But every meal has to be good. Like, if a meal that I eat is not good, it puts me in a bad mood for the rest of the day. I'm like, that was a wasted opportunity. I could have had a good meal. So food is important to me in that sense. It's not like, I want to eat, something very like have sushi or, whatever, something very exotic every day. I'm very happy eating dal chawal, but that dal chawal has to be made to a certain standard, and it has to be something that appeals to me, which is what I mean by food. And I can appreciate just having dal chawal with a little achar and a little papad. I'm very happy with that. I'm more happy with that than if you give me a substandard fish and chips, which is soggy and, whatever. So to that extent, food is important to me, and I enjoy cooking. I like making food, like, meals. I like experimenting with food. I love watching food shows to get inspiration. Like, I like watching Nigella and Jamie Oliver because they do simple, easy to make recipes. I hate watching things like MasterChef where they made food so complicated and it becomes very toxic. The kind of, pressure and the tension and the stress. I think that kind of destroys your joy in food. I hate watching shows like that.
It should never be competitive. Cooking
Yeah.
is one of those beautiful
One of
things
the
which
joys of
isn't.
life. Yeah. So to that extent, I'm very conscious of food. I'm not into food in the sense that my husband is. Like, Veer is into food in a far more cerebral sense. Like, he wants to get into things like, where ingredients come from, how they interact. And he's also interested in chefs and the various ways that cooking has evolved.
He's a full geek.
Yeah, he's fully on. I'm not interested in that. I'm only interested in what I'm eating, and what I'm eating should be good. That's like the extent of my interest in food. But that said, he doesn't get upset by bad meals as much as I do. I get really upset.
So I was, for a few years, I was a professional poker player,
Mhm.
and I used to spend a lot of time in Macau.
I didn't know
And
this.
yeah. It's a game of skill. It's the only game where you're not playing against a house.
Mhm.
So for about 5 years, that's how I
Did you
made my
make any
living.
money?
Yeah. I mean, that's why I played it. So I was professional. But I thought I'll make FU money. I
Hmm.
didn't make FU money. I made more than I would
Hmm.
make through writing. And then at one point, the
Hmm.
lifestyle was just corrosive. And
You gave it up.
I gave it up. I used to write a column on poker for the Economic Times, and in the 42nd and last edition, the headline was "Why I Loved and Left Poker." So I'll link that from the show notes. And I used to spend some time in Macau where I'd go to play some time. So once I was there with an contingent of fellow Indian players. This would have been 2014 types, and I loved the food in Macau because it's very interesting that one, of course, there is a Chinese, but it was also a Portuguese colony. So there are certain aspects of the food which are like similar in some interesting ways to Goa. So
Yeah.
there's just a lot to explore in the local food out there. And all my Indian buddies would be like, Indian food chahiye, Indian food chahiye. So there was one day where we had an evening flight from Hong Kong back to Bombay, and we had to go to the Macau ferry terminus, and there was a ferry to the airport. So we had to go to the ferry terminus in the morning at about, I think, 11:30, 12 or whatever, and then the flight was in the evening. And this bunch of guys with me said, ki nahi, Indian food chahiye, Indian food chahiye. I said, boys, we will be in India tonight.
Yeah.
It is a few hours.
Yeah.
Kindly wait till we get back. Let us grab the quickest meal we can. And eating Indian would mean going to one particular place. It
Yeah.
would take time. But they insisted. They were so homesick, and eventually we missed the flight because a ferry terminal said that to catch the 5 p.m. flight, you have to take the 12 o'clock ferry, nothing after that, some
Oh my
shit like
God.
that.
You missed the flight?
We missed the flight. But the point I'm getting at is a point that you've also pointed out in your columns with great and justified irritation, that why do so many Indians, when they go out, they just want to eat Indian food instead of enjoying
What is
the
available?
riches out there.
Yeah.
And I am a little empathetic towards them because, in many areas of my own life, I don't want to experiment. Like, I don't want to spend a lot of time listening to a lot of new music, for example. I have my comfort music, which I like. I'm happy with that. So I can understand if some people are like that about food. I make it a point to kind of always eat only what is, locally available in a particular place. So I kind of love to geek out on that as well. But I've realized that it is an intentional act, and it is an act that takes a certain amount of determination, because a lot of food that we might find in some countries just don't go with our taste buds. Initially, they are strange to us. We have to almost, through an act of will, force ourselves to be open and say that no, let me not eat something that is familiar. Let me not go to a McDonald's or some Indian place. Let me try all of this. Is it something like that with you? Because your love for travel and food kind of, again, seem to go hand in hand.
I think you should be open to. It's not necessary that you will like everything you try. It's possible you'll hate it. But how would you know that you don't like it unless you try it? Like, what I object to is people not even making the effort to try something. Like, if you have the opportunity and you're lucky enough, and not everybody is lucky enough to be able to travel abroad, it's a huge privilege that you're able to afford to do that. So you're going to a country like, say, Peru, or say, some even Paris. And if you don't want to even try something like a croque monsieur or a ceviche, maybe you like it, maybe you'll hate it. But the point is, you're not probably going to go back to that country ever again. You're probably making one trip. So why not open yourself to every possibility? There are times when I've tried things like, we went to Chengdu in China and we tried actual Chinese food in Chengdu, which is very different from the Chinese food you get in the rest of India. I mean, there were some things that I hated. I mean, which I would take once bite off and I just don't have the taste for it. I'm not going to eat it. Sometimes you find them a bit gelatinous. Sometimes you just don't like the taste of it. But then there are like out of the 10 things you order, there will be like 3 things that you really enjoy. And you probably will never ever get a chance to eat it again. So you have to open yourself up to the possibility. But I take your point about Indian food. I mean, after spending about like we went to Japan recently, and initially I was very excited and we were eating Japanese food and everything. And then after like about 4 or 5 days, I started missing the hint of spice, and you don't get Indian food there really. So we went and had a Chinese meal because you want that spicy hit because you're so used to it. So I take that point that people are used to a certain level of spice. And even me, like if I spend like a week or 10 days abroad, I call up home and I ask my housekeeper, I said, okay, make some khichdi for me and keep it. I'll come and eat that, or make some dal chawal for me. So the food you grow up with is the food that is your comfort food, which is something you will always miss. But if you are going abroad and if you're making the effort, you should at least understand the food culture of a place, what people eat. I'm not saying that you have to enjoy it or it has to become your favorite meal from then on. That's not the point. The point is you have to at least try it.
And it's not just abroad. I think you can travel within the country, and the
Exactly.
diversity is
Yeah.
so incredible.
Huge.
Like I did a food trip a few years back with about 10 friends of mine. We took a bus and we did a Mysore Mangalore kind of thing.
Oh, wow.
And like even within Mysore, within a 2 square kilometer radius, you can get like 4 different kinds of biryani, and there are so
Exactly. Yeah.
many different cuisines there which are authentic to that place,
Yeah.
which have their history from that place and have evolved
Absolutely.
simultaneously.
Absolutely.
And it's absolute madness to say that you only want a particular kind of
Yeah.
food, that you only want to have,
Yeah.
your chicken masala or matar paneer, or
Exactly. Yeah.
if you're South,
But that's a problem in India, no? That wherever you go, you basically get chana bhaturas and dal makhani wherever you go. It's very hard to find regional food that's, available anywhere. It's very hard.
what are the most delightful dishes you've eaten while traveling, which have just really taken you by surprise and been like, wow?
There's so many. I can't even see when you ask me questions like that, I go blank.
Well, okay, recently you wrote about how much you love Bangkok in some column I
Yeah.
wrote of
Oh my God.
yours. And that's my
Bangkok,
favorite food city in the
I
world.
love just eating like at very ordinary. I don't go to fancy restaurants, like very chotu places. I love the krapao they do. I love their curries. There's one particular place which does pork lard balls, which are like deep fried and served with cucumber slices. I love those. Bangkok, you can't eat badly. No matter where you go, the food is so good. It's so amazing.
And are there any surprising dishes which have blown you? Like, I remember when I went to Athens last year, just walking through the streets, we were extremely tired. So we didn't really go to some fancy restaurant. We just saw some
Yeah.
roadside place and we went in there, and I ordered something called a veal kritharaki. And a
What's that?
kritharaki is a kind of pasta that looks just like rice. So if you didn't know better, you'd think it was rice.
Oh,
And it was just the most exquisite thing that
wow.
I have had. And later on, I went to reviews of the place online, and there were people saying, "Oh, it's the best meal and I've had in
Wow.
Europe, and it is this and it is that."
Yeah, I've never
And
been to Athens.
we just found it by accident. No, in general, I would say the food is not so mind blowing there, but
Yeah.
this particular place, sheer luck, just chanced upon it, and it was great.
But
So have you
those
had?
are the best kind of meals actually. Like, when we went to Sicily for my last birthday, and we went to we were staying in Taormina, so we went to a little village nearby, and up on the hilltop there was this tiny little restaurant, and they did the most amazing pastas for us, and they were so unexpectedly good, because it's a tiny little place and you don't expect something great, but it was just so good. And that's the unexpected nature of it is what makes it so amazing. Because if you go to a Michelin star restaurant and they give you this fancy food, okay, you're expecting it, so you're not really blown away by it as such, because that's something you feel that is part of the experience or whatever. But you go to a small little tiny little place, like this time we went to Siam Paragon, in one mall restaurant we ordered some Thai food, and the quality was just so good that you were just blown away by it, that you can just go to in a little dhaba type place basically and get good food, which is quite amazing.
Yeah, I remember in Bangkok in some random mall, outside in a little stall, we had some sushi.
Mm.
And I just thought that this is better than any
Any
five-star sushi I've had in India. It's
exactly,
just
yeah.
mind-blowing.
Yeah, that's unexpectedness of something is always something that always throws you. Like sometimes you can just go and by the roadside have a really nice hot dog with a relish, and it just is just amazing. Or like a dosa at a roadside place.
What's your approach to traveling? Because, there is a classic distinction made between tourists and travelers. Tourists are just ticking boxes, ye dekh liya, wo dekh liya, had this experience, had that experience. Travelers, typically, more immersive, kind of soaking it up and all of that. What's been your approach towards traveling? What are the cities you've been most surprised by and why?
I'm essentially a creature of habit. I like going back to the same places. I, that's it. I'm changing a bit now because, as I told you, I feel time is running out and I should see parts of the world that I've not seen before. But there was a period in my life that no matter whenever I had time off, I would go to London because it was the one place that I really loved, either London or Bangkok. I mean, that's like one of the two favorite cities of mine in the world. But of late, I've discovered a newfound love for Italy because I just find the place so amazing. I don't really mean the bigger cities, I mean the smaller centers, just traveling around in the countryside, just stopping by, going to a little rustic place and having food or whatever. I really enjoy that. So now I try and do Italy about twice a year because I want to spend the rest of my life just exploring different parts of it. So I'm quite excited about that. But whether I'm a tourist or a traveler, I don't know. I think I'm a tourist. I don't think I'm a traveler. But I don't feel like a tourist in London or Bangkok because they are like almost like cities I know so well. Like I have my specific places where I go to. I have friends now who I meet. So it's almost like a home away from home, because you spend so much time there. But yeah, in Italy, I'm definitely a tourist.
As a young person, I was exposed very early on to a lot of world cinema, and one of my favorite filmmakers was Fellini.
Ah, of
And
course.
I would watch my favorite Fellini film is E with Aloni, one of his younger coming of age films. But I remember while watching Amarcord, which I think is a film he made in 1975, and and I just thought that, hey, these Italian families, and of course I hadn't been to Italy then, and it's still one European country I haven't yet visited. But at that time I thought that, hey, these Italian families with their exuberance and shows of emotion and all of that are just like all the Bengali
Yeah,
families I know.
exactly.
So, do you feel there's something there?
100%. I think Italians are very like Indians, They have, you said they're very into family, they're very affectionate, they're very exuberant, they love food. Like, it's hard to go to a Italian's house and not being fed to bursting point, like it is in India. They want to feed you or whatever. So, I think there are a lot of similarities between the two of them, but the Italians are much more elegant than us. They have a certain inborn elegance. Like, even the poorest person will dress with such flair and, amazing colors and beautiful designs and stuff. And they spend a lot of their time, in Italian, there's this phrase that you have to cut a good figure, like a bella figura. You have to present the best version of yourself to the world. So even if you don't have money or whatever, you still have to, present yourself well, which I think is a fabulous concept.
Indeed, it is, and
And it's not just about appearance. Like your house has to be, look nice, elegant. The food must be presented in an elegant way, which is a good way to live.
do Indian men have a problem with the way they present themselves, or even with the very notion of self-love, which is implicit in this?
Indian men. Now, I don't want to say anything about Indian men. You want me to be trolled on Twitter?
Twitter people don't listen to this fourth hour of the podcast where they're going to troll you, so don't worry about it.
Indian men don't dress very well, do they?
They absolutely don't. But you, you probably observed this much more closely. So
Yeah, but it's changing. I think the younger generation is more into looking good and wearing. See, by dressing well, I don't necessarily mean wearing designer clothes or something, but just taking a little bit of pride in the way you look. It's not there. It's not ingrained in Indian men so much. And somehow Indian men also even They wear too tight clothes, no?
Part of that is really majburi. I had the great food writer Pushpesh Pant on
Oh, okay,
my
I know
show,
him, yes.
and Pushpesh ji and I had the same sort of lament,
Hmm.
which is that if you have a certain kind of pot belly at a certain age, you it's very hard to find clothes that
Hey,
fit
so
you.
I don't understand. Okay, you have a pot belly, then wear a kurta, no?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
so elegant.
that's what I said to Pushpesh ji,
हाँ,
and he agreed with me that even finding a kurta that fits these days is really
तो
hard
टेलर
because
के पास चले जाओ.
तो टेल उतना एफर्ट लेना पड़ता है, रेडीमेड में मिलना चाहिए ना.
Hey,
When
Fab India does very good kurta.
No, but now even a lot of the kurtas you find are slim fit and all that. They
Really?
fit my shoulder, bulge in the middle, and of course I am on an extreme weight loss program, so I will be very dapper and well dressed in a while.
See,
But
I don't like. For instance, I don't think it's important that you have to be thin to be dressed well. There are always styles that will look good on you.
true, but Pushpesh ji would disagree very vociferously with
He's not
that and
fat,
point
is he?
out.
He's quite thin.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to comment on Pushpesh ji's bulk or lack thereof, but
I met him about a year ago in Calcutta. He was there at some literary festival where I saw him. He looked quite thin.
ask him about pajamas sometimes, and every tailor he goes to now says pocket kahan dalu, and he is like pajama mein pocket hota hai, kya baat kar rahe ho? So you know,
But
so
it's convenient to have a pocket in a pajama, yeah.
yes, but Pushpesh ji would argue that we have so many different kinds of pajamas, and Aligarhi pajama, this pajama, that pajama, and you're all homogenizing it to in a certain way
That is true.
for function, and I guess this is sort of a lament that anyone who loves food may also feel. That Vikram Doctor, the food writer, was on my show a long time ago, and Vikram had this lament about the Cavendish banana, which was a banana that was exported from India to the US and all that, and it's very suited to economies of scale. It lasts a long time, so there it became the dominant banana, and then they exported it back to India, and here it is replacing a lot of indigenous banana forms which are dying out,
Mm.
because a Cavendish banana just makes
Life easier.
yeah, it just makes life so much easier. And the lament then was that things get homogenized in that way. Pushpesh ji's lament was a similar lament about food, that wherever you go to a wedding now, anywhere in India, you'll have the same bloody Punjabi food
That's
and
true.
all of that. And
That is true. I think Punjabi food has kind of taken over the whole, universe. It's quite strange, actually. And Bengali food has been left behind, whereas actually Bengali food can be really good.
I mean, all our local cuisines are quite.
But I think it's changing. Like even in London, there's this new restaurant that's opened. I think it's called Charangi or something, which is doing Bengali food. Then in New York, there's this guy called Ronnie Mozumdar and Chintan Pandya who started this restaurant called Dhamaka. And they've started another restaurant called Seema, which does South Indian food, Tamil food.
Wow.
And they're not terribly expensive or anything, but really super hard to get into because they're quite small. And the food is amazing. I mean, so the regional cuisine is coming up, but I think at the quality level, I think people still go with the dal makhnis and the butter chickens and all of that. And that's going to take time to be phased out because people like it.
Yeah, and I'm actually okay if they're there, as long as
Other things also come.
yeah, as long as the long tail is healthy, which I actually think it is getting healthier
I
today.
think it is, yeah.
People are like now there are home kitchens all over the place. Like in Bombay, I order from this home kitchen which will give Naga pork stew,
Oh,
and
wow. What's it called?
it's I'll link it from the show notes. It's
Uh-huh.
called the slow food something, I forget
Oh,
exactly.
wow.
But and there are many home kitchens like this which will specialize in a handful of things and do it really well, and
But that's great, no?
yeah, it's
I mean, to
it's
get Naga pork stew in Bombay is amazing. You don't even get it in Delhi, I think.
yeah, Kerala beef chili and all that. So they probably
Kerala,
use
you get a
puff.
lot of good Kerala food in Delhi. There's this Mahabali and
Yeah,
they do good food, yeah.
Savia Rasa who does great
Yeah.
South Indian food.
And there's the Goa Southern does good Goan food. I don't know if you tried it. There's a small restaurant there. I don't know if it still exists. Can't remember what it's called. But there is a lot of. Then there's this place called Jamun that does in Lodi Colony Market that does good regional food as well. I think regional food is having a bit of a revival. Hopefully.
So you mentioned earlier that you did not bond with Veer over food. So can I ask what did you bond about? Like how what was the trajectory of that, if you don't mind talking about it?
Yeah, I think he was my boss to begin with. So
Mm.
for many years, it was we had a very collegial atmosphere in Sunday. Like there was no big hierarchy. Like everybody called Veer Veer. It wasn't like Sir or Mr. Sangvi or whatever. Everybody,
And he was pretty young for an editor as
yeah,
well.
he was like 31, 32 at that point. So he was pretty young too. And I think we bonded over books, writing, reading, that kind of thing. It wasn't, food wasn't really a big thing because there wasn't very much food happening in Calcutta where we were.
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest thing happened in Calcutta was the Taj opening and Shonar and, the restaurants over there. Otherwise, I mean, Calcutta, it was basically Amber where we used to go to for kebabs and naans. And there used to be this little junky Chinese place next to our AVP office called Chungwa, where all the AVP guys used to hang out and have chop suey and hot and sour soup and stuff like that. So food, there wasn't a big food scene anyway. It was a very different Calcutta in those days. The big spot was maybe getting Armenia biryani ordered into office and eating that or something. So food wasn't a big thing, but I think we just had the same interests. I mean, we both like reading, we both liked writing, we had the same sort of interests. And, when you work together, you kind of form a bond. So I think that's basically what it was. It wasn't like any particular thing that bonded us together.
But just sort of working together, that becomes friendship, that becomes
That becomes,
romance.
yeah. I think it's a progression. It's not like coup de foudre that you suddenly turn up and you say, oh, wow, this is it. It wasn't like that.
And there's a beautiful essay I sort of linked to recently on Twitter by a friend of mine, Samarth Bansal, who's been a guest on this show as well. And he's in his late 20s and he talks about the whole dating game for him, using these apps and kind of figuring out what one has to do, how one dances this particular dance. And the modern world is like so much more complicated and all of that. And in a sense, we are the transitional generation, that we grew up on that side of the line. And now, we are sort of onlookers on
Yeah.
this side of the line. And what are your thoughts about the way this kind of world has
Gosh, I wouldn't
changed?
want to be young now.
You don't want to be young now.
Oh my God, no way. There's just too much. These dating apps are like horrific, man. I mean, would you want to be part of this?
It sounds horrendous
It
because
sounds
this.
horrendous to me, frankly. I mean, first of all, it's extremely transactional, isn't it? Like, I mean, there is no gradual progression at all. Like in the old days, you met somebody through a friend or you met somebody in college, and it was like a gradual process of discovering each other, getting to know each other. But it's a lot of pressure meeting somebody on a date, like, for the first time. What conversation do you have? Which part of yourself do you project? Which part do you not? I mean, it's too much pressure. I don't want to do it.
Yeah, Samarth has these lovely lines where he talks about how for men, dating today is like dying of thirst in the desert, not a drop of water in sight. And for women, it's like dying of thirst in the ocean. Water is everywhere, but it's mostly toxic and full of salt.
It's a very good line.
Yeah. So maybe someday I should have him back on the show to
That's
discuss
really
that.
cool. Have you been on dating app ever?
No, no.
No, no, never.
I mean, my time is gone. So let's talk about journalism because even there, you sort of began in one era and ended up in another era entirely
Absolutely.
today. So tell me about how the world started changing, from your vantage point. Did it require a mental adjustment that suddenly you're in one kind of world where there's a certain way that the world works? There's a form that journalism takes, that there are editors and those editors have to also be mentors at the same time. There's certain kind of journalistic values in place, so on and so forth. And then the whole game changes where today I would argue the mainstream is completely irrelevant and the incentives of newsrooms have changed, the way we consume information, the way we discover information, everything has
Everything
changed.
has changed. Yeah, you're very right. In fact, when we started out, there were only a few legacy newspapers and magazines in the market. So in a sense, today we have far more democratization of the news space because you don't need those huge resources to come into the news space. You can still come in with maybe a YouTube channel, or you can come in. So, in some ways, I think it's a positive thing because more people have a voice. So, you have a multiplicity of viewpoints that are coming into the mainstream. When I started off in journalism, there was what? In Calcutta, there was the Statesman and the Telegraph. In Delhi, it was Times of India and Hindustan Times. In the South, it was Hindu. Bombay was basically Times of India. Hindustan Times didn't exist in Bombay in those days. And magazines, there were what? Sunday, India Today, and maybe The Week, but Week wasn't really that popular or anything. So I think the kind of choices that we have today in terms of what media you want to consume are certainly much larger. I'm not sure that they're much better as a consequence because you have to be far more discerning about what you want to consume. Like, for instance, I have just stopped watching news TV because I feel that it's a complete waste of time. I don't learn anything from it. There was a time when I used to watch a bit of NDTV just to get a sense of what was happening in the country. But now I find you don't even get news stories any longer. It's just basically debate shows. It's like a talk radio with four
It's
people on the
narrative
screen.
battles. You can kind of predict what everyone is going to say.
Yeah. So I think you just have to choose what you want to, because there's enough new digital voices coming up that are actually doing much fresher and much more honest journalism because A, they can afford to do it, and two, there are not the pressures that legacy media has. With legacy media, you really have to be careful what they say and what you don't say, which is quite sad in a sense. But with digital voices like The Wire or print, even, I think they get to do. So in some ways, I think I don't think we should knock the fact that more people are in the marketplace. I think it's good that there are more people in the media scrum, and it's healthy in a way that people are getting a choice to do this. And certainly, Hindi journalism has really gone the much better than it was before in terms of reach and in terms of what it used to be. So I find it quite hopeful in a sense than what it used to be.
No, I mean, we would not be sitting here and talking if this change hadn't happened because,
Exactly, yeah.
if I were to pitch my show to any conventional mainstream outlet 20 years ago, they would have laughed me out of the room that what you want to talk to someone for many hours, are you crazy? And a lot of creators who are doing well today, if not literally all of them, would never get past a gatekeeper. What has also happened, though, is that in the 80s and the 90s, there was a consensus on truth, a broad consensus, right? Sunday and India Today and Frontline may cover things a little separately and you knew what the tilts were, but you would broadly know that they're all relatively solid and, there might be a difference in the viewpoint, but facts are facts and there is some fidelity to the truth. Today, I think that trust has vanished. The mainstream has kind of dissipated. And I think what that's also done is that the role that curators used to play in that time, the role that perhaps people like we used to play in that time, that no longer exists almost. The search for truth has been replaced by narrative battles. And I often wonder then that old school journalists like you guys, how do you sort of reconcile with that? Because at one level, like you said, it's great that anybody can get into the game and do things, and that gives you guys an opportunity also to do interesting things and to experiment. But at the same time, the sort of position that you had, big fish in a small pond, in a sense, to use a very crude metaphor, I can't really find a good one for this. That's not exactly what I mean, but you know what I mean.
I know it.
And that's kind of changed. And I'm just wondering that then at a human level, how does one come to terms with that? That earlier there were just a few voices and you were one of those voices, and it was largely collegial and other people might criticize you once in a while. But today on social media especially, it's a free for all. Suddenly you can get 2000 retweets blasting you for a misinterpretation of a word you might have used, right? And the world changes in that way. And I would imagine that it can move people in different directions. That one, you get angry and ossified and you're like, in my times, and like you pointed out, you have this lovely sort of acronym RW, remember when, right? And you could get into that kind of mode. Or you can embrace this new world with a certain kind of humility and say that it's great. I love this young energy. I'm going to use some of it myself. So
I think when you talk about legacy media and new voices emerging, I find even on the new platforms, the legacy media voices are still the strongest. Like Shekhar Gupta will still have more people following him, and Ravish will have more people following him than say the younger lot of people, which is a consequence of the following that they built up over the years. Now, maybe with demographic changes that may change 10 years down the line, but I think the stronger voices on media are still the old voices. I don't see very many very strong voices emerging unless you have some examples. I can't think of any.
No, you're right. And Shekhar Gupta also has gotten there by having the humility to say that I can't achieve what I achieved then in that form, so I will do cut the
Something
clutter.
different, yeah.
I will do a
Yeah.
YouTube show and I will try
Exactly.
this
So
new
he's
thing.
doing something different. But I think it is possible to shift your following from one set of media to the other. I think it is possible. But you have to be a little nimble and a little agile to be able to do it. And I think not very many legacy media types have that agility to do it, like Shekhar does. He's managed to make that transition, and he's built up a huge following in this
He's
new thing.
fantastic.
So I think it's possible to do that. And I think, at the end of the day, it doesn't pay to be snobbish and elitist and say that, because I have 100,000 followers, I am bigger than you. It doesn't work like that. I mean, everybody's voice is important. That said, if somebody is rude and obnoxious, then that's not the point. But having a debate with people, I'm all for it. Like there are a lot of people, like, I would count myself as a liberal. There are a lot of liberals like me who will not, for instance, follow a single right-wing handle because they just don't want to engage with that, which I find is silly, because you have to engage with people. If you're a journalist especially, you can't be in this little liberal elite echo chamber and just listen and talk to the people who think exactly the way you do. You may have your views and you may have your principles or whatever, but there's no harm in just opening yourself up and listening to what the other person has to say, as long as they're not abusive and they're not trolling you or whatever. So I am actually quite happy with the fact that the media has opened up, because I find that legacy media is a little bit stultified now. It's a little bit old school or whatever. It hasn't made that transition to this new era where people's attention spans are shorter. You have to appeal to them in a certain way. You can't really, like, I don't know very many young people who read newspapers any longer. The only way they would read newspapers is if, for instance, they see a link on Twitter or on Instagram or something and they'll read it. But newspapers haven't made that transition. So they think that you have to subscribe to the entire newspaper to read it. Not many people want to do that. So why not make it possible for them to pay something and read one piece? Or, they have to make that little bit of a mind shift, to be able to access the younger readership, because I find that newspapers are really dying out because the younger generation is really not interested in reading newspapers. Magazines, I think, are dead anyway.
Yeah, I think for a moment I'm going to feel good because you have almost, used the term younger generation for me because I haven't read. I stopped subscribing to newspapers when COVID started because at that time the people weren't delivering.
Mm.
And then I realized I don't want to continue. It was
Yeah.
just inertia. It
Well,
was
we still get it, but I don't read them. Veer reads them because he's old school. So
Yeah.
he reads all of them. He gets like 5 or 6 newspapers. But like I find I do most of my reading on my phone now. I read I like to think that I'm living in a parallel universe because I read the NYT and Washington Post and London Times and Telegraph in the morning while he's reading Hindustan Times.
And I'm kind of thinking aloud at what happens with that form of how you consume news also can change the person that you are. And, and in the case of you and Veer, you've had that whole rounded experience. You've seen everything. It doesn't matter. In the case of a young person, and it can matter in the sense that a 15-year-old kid today can begin his consumption of, say, YouTube when somebody sends him this crazy right-wing video.
Yeah.
And he watches that. And then the algorithm takes over. Like I once
And then
entered.
he's only fed that.
Then he's only fed that. Like I once did this experiment where I wanted to understand the ultra right wing, the guys who think Modi and Adityanath are letting them down, those kinds of sort of really hardcore,
Yeah.
and just try and understand that what's going on there. So I didn't want my regular YouTube algorithm to get messed up, so I opened incognito window, new Gmail account, and so I now have two YouTubes.
Oh, wow.
And the thing is that there is no overlap between these YouTubes. These are completely different worlds. And the world that I get on that other YouTube that I opened for myself, which a 15-year-old kid may get, and that may be the only world he absolutely knows, right? Where you become a slave to the algorithm without even
Absolutely.
realizing it. While the benefit of having a newspaper is that a newspaper and most of our newspapers still will have a diversity of
Yeah.
news and a diversity of views,
Yeah.
and you'll be able to see different parts of the world in them.
And also there will be at least a pretense at impartiality,
Yeah.
whereas YouTube is very much one side or the other. But a lot of young people, like my niece's husband the other day sent me a link that of a video of Dhruv Rathi, who is apparently very very popular, doing something on Manipur or whatever. So a lot of people are getting their political information really from these videos rather than from television even. I think television viewership has also gone down because people are tired of this format of constant shouting and screaming at each other. People have kind of moved away to digital media, which is actually a huge opportunity, for somebody to do something really good with it.
It's a huge opportunity, and like I haven't watched news television in some 10, 12 years.
Yeah, me
And
too.
my sense of YouTube is that I am glad that the means of production are available to anyone. Like I started a YouTube podcast recently with a friend of mine. Episode 5 releases tomorrow after we kind of record this. Though I find that there at the present moment, the way the ecosystem is that you'll either go down a particular direction and be part of the right wing algorithm or this whatever, or you are functioning at a really shallow level. And and Shekhar Gupta is of course an exception there, and I'm glad that he kind of
But
does
even
struck on the
Barkha's
plateau.
Mojo does well.
Barkha's Mojo does an amazing job,
Does
and
good well.
more power to her for saying
Yeah.
that I don't need television, I can do YouTube.
Yeah,
And
that's huge. I mean,
Faye D'Souza does a
yeah.
great job as
Faye, I
well.
haven't seen. I must watch her. I haven't seen her. She's got her own channel, is it?
I think so. Last I checked, and certainly on Instagram she's active and stuff
Ah.
like that. I must invite her to the show someday.
Yeah,
but-
she's good. I saw the stand up she did. I thought she was very good.
yeah.
Did you see
yeah.
the stand up?
No, I missed it.
She
yeah.
did a stand up because she wanted to challenge herself. It was really fun.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Are you ever going to do a stand up?
No way.
What is some secret daydream you still have?
Secret daydream. Gosh, nothing really. No. What's your daydream?
My daydream. I have actually tried to make myself consciously stop daydreaming, but I just like for the longest time I wanted to write books and not had the discipline to be able to do that. And it's not even a daydream; it's a legit sort of aspiration that I want to.
So you're writing?
I'm trying to, but it's the thing is that people look at me from a distance and they say ki haan, every Monday his Seen Unseen comes out, and now every Friday YouTube show comes out. He must be so disciplined. He teaches a writing course, but actually those are weekly deadlines. I do them, but the things I really really want to do deep inside, there are no deadlines. There's nothing push external like that. And I find it incredibly hard to sort of internally be able to push myself to do that, which is where
So write
I
a
will-
contract.
I will-
Sign a contract with someone.
No, I have publisher and all that. The brilliant Kartika ji from Westland, and she has said we'll publish. She said yes to every book idea I have given her, but
Now
it
you
is
have to write it.
now I have to write it.
So you
But
set a time for it.
I've done all those tricks. In my writing course, actually, my 4th webinar is entirely about process, discipline, habits.
But you can't do it yourself.
Yeah, and I'm mentally thinking when I teach that class that do as I say, don't do as I do.
But there are periods when your creativity is just fallow. Like there are times when you feel like the words are not coming or the ideas are not clicking. You just have to give yourself a break and then go back to it.
Tell me about yourself. Tell me about, you had written a book in 2007,
Yeah.
Women on Top, I
Yeah,
think it
that was
called.
non-fiction. Yeah,
That was non-fiction, but now you've written these two
two fiction
exciting
books. Yeah,
novels.
yeah. So I quite enjoyed doing that actually. The first one I did, Racecourse Road. That, to be honest, was not my idea. That was David Davidar's idea. He called me and asked to meet me. So I went and saw him. We met at the Hyatt and we had this discussion. And he said he wanted me, he had two ideas, which is that he wanted me to do a kind of novel set in Delhi, high society and, that kind of thing, which frankly didn't appeal to me that much because it seems very cliched, that same old high society nonsense. I can't do that. And then he said, the other thing is you do something set in the world of politics, which was exciting for me because, there are so many things that you have information that you've gathered over the years which you've not really used and it's just floating around in your mind somewhere and you feel that you can put it in a novel. And so I said I'd do that, and then I signed this with him. And then I thought, if I'm going to do a political novel, I can't just do it as a normal, politics and politicking and all. I want to make it more like a suspense thriller kind of thing. So I decided to start it with the prime minister being assassinated. So then the assassination becomes a plot point that you're trying to solve. So it becomes almost like a murder mystery. So the politics is almost incidental. It's not like the main. It's just the milieu in which this thing happens. And I really enjoyed writing that book because I could draw on my memories and my experiences of political reporting and put it in. And I put in things like a general election. So I could put in things of rallies and, all the stuffs that I had done. And I really enjoyed that book. Then after I'd done that, I decided to do a sequel because I'd left it hanging in the middle. And for this one, I went with Penguin rather than Aleph. So I changed publishers. And I wanted to do a very different style of book. I mean, that was like a more character driven and more cerebral novelist. And I wanted to do a proper page turner this time. So that was fun to do because you're doing something a little different. The genre is a little different. Otherwise, you get stuck in that, rut of writing the same novel over and over again. So I enjoyed doing that. And now I'm writing a spy novel, which I'm really excited about because I'm bringing back all the memories of when I was interviewed by Raw
Yeah.
and all the stuff that could have been, I'm writing about in my book now. So that's great fun.
I'm actually, now that you planted that thought in my head, I'm wondering if you did join Raw at that point and you're
See?
still playing that game.
See.
Your latest assignment: infiltrate the scene and the unseen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Get us Dopan Verma. So, tell me about the discipline, because this is not really a trivial task to write a couple of books like this and to slightly change the tone and the voice and all of that as you did. And you mentioned that COVID helped you write Madam Prime Minister.
Yeah, but it's actually the hardest thing I've ever done because journalism is easy in a sense and columns are easy because there's a certain subject, you have the information, you just put it together and you can do it. But fiction means you're actually generating the ideas in your imagination. It's not something you're picking up from real life and just putting in a book or whatever. And plus, you have to have character development. You have to find a voice for every different character. They can't sound alike. They should speak differently. Their voice patterns have to change. So it is tough, but I just find it easy. The way I do it is that I have the basic outline in mind, what story is going to be. I have a basic breakup of chapters, that this is what happens in chapter 1, 2, 3. I mean, obviously things change in the middle. It's not like it's set in stone or anything. And I find that once I have that essential scaffolding in place, then I can say, okay, like first chapter, I'm going to spend like 2 weeks just working on it. And I find that helps me because then I'm not thinking of the whole book. I'm just thinking I have to do these 5,000 words in 2 weeks, which is a doable task. So if I were to start thinking that I have to write 100,000 words for the book, I would be overwhelmed. But as long as I'm just thinking about doing that one chapter, I can cope. And then when I'm done with that, then I can move on and do the next 5,000 words. And I can work like that. But if I were to try and, do it at one go and not break it up, I would find it very tough.
So my friend Ajay Shah sometimes repeatedly, in fact, talks about how Tolstoy would write his books.
Mm.
And he says that, when Tolstoy wrote War and Peace, his family reported that he was there, but he was not present. He was walking around the house all day, lost in the world of the book. And sometimes he would be weeping and sometimes he would be laughing, but he's lost in the world of the book. So,
No, I'm not. I'm nothing like that.
you're nothing like that.
No. I have a thing. I don't spend more than 3 hours or 4 hours writing, because
In
I
a
think
day.
in a day, because beyond that I can't really concentrate. I my target is to do about 750 to 1,000 words, but sometimes even if I do 500, that's fine. It's okay. But I write during the afternoon when, like, there's nobody around, and there's like, so I would write from, say, maybe 2 to 6, or 3 to 7, or whatever. And beyond that, my brain doesn't function. I can't do more than that. But I think if you do that much every day, you're fine. I don't think you need to do more.
Why the afternoon? A lot of writers say they like to write first thing in the morning when they're fresh.
I'm not a
And
morning person.
not a morning person.
I'm really not a morning person.
You've written a great column also about owls versus
And
larks,
larks, yes.
and I'm an owl like you.
Yeah.
And the world just treats us so badly.
I
It's like they
know.
pass moral judgment for waking
Exactly.
up late.
I know, it's ridiculous. That's our circadian rhythm.
Yeah, the other day I was staying over at a friend's house and I asked him, "Hey, what time do you wake up?" And he said, "I wake up late." And I was like, damn relieved.
He said
And
8
then he
o'clock.
said, "I'll wake up by 7:30." And I'm like, boss, boss.
Not happening.
Yeah,
Not
it's
happening.
cruelty. Joan Didion once said, "I don't know what I think until I write it down."
Oh, wow.
And I did a great episode with Amitabh Kumar where he spoke about, where he was raving about the habit of journaling. And since then, I have come to recommend it to all my writing students. Many of them have done it to great benefit. And the idea simply being that every time that you sit down and write, you are it deepens your engagement with the world because you're thinking about the world and so on. But in a sense, you're also shaping yourself every time you kind of sit down and write. And you've done really different kinds of writing in the sense that you have your columns. And for your columns, I'm guessing you have a weekly deadline. And I'm guessing if Thursday is the deadline, by Tuesday, your mind is ticking
Yeah.
over. You kind of shortlist what you're going to write about and you write it. You've had a rich life as a reporter, as an editor. Now these two books, to what extent do you feel that, writing has helped shape you or understand yourself better? Like, did these two books play a part in that? What was it like?
I don't know if it's shaped me. I wouldn't say that. No. I think they were like, they were books that I really needed to write because I wanted to use all that information that I had inside me, which I hadn't. There's so many things you pick up in politics which you can't really write about because it's at the level of gossip, and you can't really do it because of libel laws or whatever, but you can always put it in a book and write it up as fiction. So I think they were like books that I really wanted to write to get that out of it. But I don't think that they've shaped me in any sense. I think my column has probably shaped me more than the fiction, because the column I've been doing for like 20 years now, so it's been a long time, and it's kind of evolved. It's had, the voice has evolved as I've grown older, so it's I think the column is far more something that's shaped me than the book.
It's often deliciously introspective, but also with such a casual tone that is very easy to relate to it. It's not ponderous. Parumita Vora uses this great term, men with beards. Ponderous people giving gyan on the world. And she doesn't mean it literally. So if Veer is listening to this, I don't think you're meant by this. Your writing is like really friendly and accessible, but at the same time, I sort of disagree about the superficial candor. I feel that there's...
It's more than superficial.
I find a lot of depth in it. I've cited the columns that I really liked about photographs and about various other, even an Instagram post. I think there was one Instagram post where you posted a picture of your mom and your grandmom or something. And,
Yeah.
Even little touches like that can really be evocative. I was struck by the fact that you said when you were thinking about your first book, David said that, hey, one option is South Delhi and, whatever the Milu that you're in and all of that. And you said, nah, Ghisa Pitta, like, why should I write about that? And in this lovely column you wrote recently, you spoke about this surprisingly restrained wedding you attended,
Yes.
where there wasn't so much shosha, there
Yeah.
weren't celebrities for the sake of it.
Yeah.
The bride's mom was greeting everyone while they came and while they went. And just in that contrast itself, by talking about the contrast, you were also implicitly painting a picture of
Of the
a certain
kind of
a,
wedding.
a certain kind of wedding and a certain kind of world. And Shreyana Bhattacharya, in a book Desperately Seeking Shahrukh, wrote really eloquently about it, and
Mm.
in her episode with me spoke about it. She has this memorable phrase about how so much of the dating game, and I think this is very much in a South Delhi context, involves men with unwarranted self-confidence and women with unwarranted self-doubt.
Oh my God.
And that also strikes me as just being I can't speak for South Delhi, but certainly in South Bombay, one can see those kind of vibes and so on and so forth. And while you are very much a part of these world of the English speaking elites, Lutyens really, as it were, the Khan market
Yeah, the
liberals,
Khan Market gang. Yeah.
but at the same time, in your work, especially in your early political reporting with Sunday, where you've gone around the country with different politicians and gone to their constituencies with them, traveled with them, etc., etc., and at the same time, you've also then come to Bombay and covered the film world, not just the glamour, etc., etc., but also
The
behind the
business
scenes
end.
and the
Yeah.
frustrations and all of that. So you've seen all those different Indias, which typically would be unseen for a lot of people from who belong to the Latins elite, as it
Hmm.
were. So what part do you think has that played in the way that you think about the world? And when you look at people around you who may not have had perhaps a good fortune of that kind of exposure, do you feel that there are layers that you see that they don't see and that they would be better off seeing it perhaps?
I think what happens when I think it's also a consequence of being a journalist that you're exposed to so many different people. Like when you're young, you meet famous people or whatever. In a sense, you lose that sense of awe, that sense of awe that people have about celebrities, ki, बहुत famous hai, ye करता है, वो करता है. A lot of people have that sense of awe. But when you see them up close and you interview them or whatever, you realize that they're just people like you and me, that sense of looking up to people or idolizing people or being in awe of people that just goes away. I think that's one of the biggest advantages that you have as a journalist, that you've seen people up close and you've seen them maybe at their worst and whatever, so you kind of are or whatever, and that kind of gives you a certain degree of, I don't know whether I should call it confidence or security or whatever you want to call it, but I really don't understand how people get so insecure about wanting to drive the right car, for instance, or wanting, you drive into a Taj, you have to be seen getting out of a Mercedes. I don't understand that. How does it matter what car you drive? But there are people who are obsessed with it in this Lutyens Delhi world, maybe even in South Bombay. I mean, I'm not that familiar with South Bombay. I'm sure it's the same. There are people who get obsessed with what your address is, that they will want to stay in like the right part of town and not over, not be seen as coming from the wrong side of the tracks or whatever. I really don't get that, because and to be honest with you, though people say this about Delhi, that people are very status conscious and people are very. I moved to Delhi when I was about 29 or so. When I joined the Telegraph, I moved to Delhi to live here. I used to live in a Barsati. I used to drive a Mercedes. Sorry, not a Mercedes, a Maruti. I used to drive a Maruti. And I never felt that anybody was looking down on me. I met the richest people in the world. I would interview them, I would meet them. Some of them became friends. Some of them are still my friends. And I never felt this sense that they were looking down on me because I earned much less than them or because I lived in a small, but I never felt that. So I think half of it is also self kind of, propelled, that you feel the sense of inferiority. It's not that other people are making, because nobody can make you feel inferior without your permission. It has to be something that comes from within you. And I think as long as you have that sense of self and you're you're secure in that sense of self, it doesn't really matter whether you live in Lachan's Delhi or whether you live in Noida or whether you live in Gurgaon. I don't think these things matter. But people do kind of talk like that. So I don't know what to say.
You mentioned, driving, everybody wants to drive a particular kind of car and blah, blah, blah. And you've also written a great column about how there was a celebrity chef and he was wearing a particular kind of sneaker.
And everybody else.
And you looked at his staff and they're all wearing that particular kind of sneaker,
Yeah.
perhaps without realizing it, just
Yeah.
different colors. And I was reminded of this concept I've been really taken by as a frame to understand people over the last year. Luke Burgess, who's been on my show recently, he'd written this great book called Wanting, where he spoke about René Girard's concept of mimetic desire. René Girard was a philosopher of the last century who was asked to teach a course in literature, which was not his core subject, but he needed the money, so he said, okay. So he goes through this reading list of great books, and he comes to the conclusion that in all of them, the main character wants something because somebody else wants it. So it is what he calls a mimetic desire, from which, Burgess introduced me to the frame of thick and thin desires, where a thin desire is a mimetic desire. You want it because somebody else wants it. So it could be, hey, I want to drive a Mercedes, or, if you're a young woman in India, it might be, I want to get married and have kids, not because you intrinsically do, but that's
you
what is
see everyone
expected
around.
of you. And those are thin desires. They're often mimetic. We don't realize it, and they can be intense. That they're thin doesn't mean that they're not intense. They can be intense. You might think that's the only thing you want. Your life depends on that. And then there are thick desires, which are intrinsic to you, which have nothing to do with mimesis or copying others. Like in your case, I imagine that walking in Sundar Nursery, walking among nature, looking at flowers is a manifestation of a thick desire, if not a thick desire in itself, a desire for a particular vibe or a particular way of being. And thin desires are all of these people wanting fancy cars, wanting a particular kind of life and all of that. And when I look back on my life and I realize that many of the things I wanted them for the wrong reasons. And, like I was just like, for example, even the desire to write. I was chatting about this with Nilanjana Roy, who did an episode here exactly a year ago. And even the desire to write can have both thin and thick aspects to it, where the thin aspect can be ki, I want validation. I want to write a bestseller. I want to win the Booker Prize. I want to do this. I want to do that. Whereas the thicker desire could just be that I like writing. I like telling stories. I like getting into the head of a character or creating a universe, and I'm wondering if, you could reflect back on your life, for example, were there thin desires that when you look back, you're like, hey, why did I ever want that? And over time, has your becoming better acquainted with yourself? And as you correctly said at the start of the show, we can never truly know ourselves, but has that process of being better acquainted with yourself also helped you understand what are your thick desires that, maybe during COVID, you said you realized some of that because all the extrinsic stuff
Yeah.
went away?
I think writing would be a thick desire, definitely. It's a strange conundrum actually, because when I think about it, I love the concept of writing a book, but when I actually get down to doing it, oh my God, I struggle. I really struggle. But the thought of giving it up would make me unhappier. But it's not like the act of writing is a great joy for me, because it's not. It's tough. I struggle with it. It doesn't come that easily. Like writing a column comes easily. I can finish it in an hour and a half or whatever. I'm done. But writing a book is really tough for me. I really have to work at it. I have to kind of motivate myself to keep doing it or whatever. But it's something that I really, really want to do, even though it's not terribly enjoyable in the moment. But once I've done it, then the sense of satisfaction I get from that is far greater than I get from writing a column. So it's a little bit more complicated than just my feeling joy in writing. I don't feel joy in writing. I feel joy having written. It only comes afterwards.
I think it's the same for all writers.
Yeah,
it's
I
just
struggle.
bloody difficult.
I find it tough. Yeah, there are a lot of people who just, like someone like Shashi Tharoor. I don't know how he does it. He writes these, humongous books while doing so much other stuff. I mean, he really enjoys writing. I don't think I could do that. I don't have that prolific thing that he does.
Maybe he's cloned himself, or maybe he's from the
It's
future.
right.
Yeah, it's somewhere in a shed in his house. There are like 4 Shashi
Who's
Tharoors.
writing?
2 are writing books. One is doing speeches. One is just learning new words from a thesaurus. So
Yeah.
I don't want to make fun of the guy. He's a lovely man. He's
No,
come
he's
on the
nice.
show.
He's
Yeah,
been on
yeah.
your show, yeah? He's good fun.
He's very good fun. One of my favorite quotes is by Annie Dillard, and she says, "How we spend our days is how we spend our lives." And that to me is a profound truth, because often what happens is we will spend our day doing one thing, and in the grand narrative in our heads, our lives are something else. But the truth is that ultimately how we spend our days is how we spend our lives. It,
Yeah.
it, it really boils down to our everyday habits and all of that. So I want to ask you about how you spend your days these days. Like, apart from today, where you've been really kind enough to,
Yeah.
do what you say is your first podcast, and
Yes, it is.
it's an outlier event in your life, and thank you so much for that. But apart from that,
What do I do?
how do you spend your days, and is there something you would like to change about that?
My days are not. I mean, one varies a lot from the other. I I spend a lot of time reading, because I find that like at the moment I'm not writing my book, because I'm going through this fallow phase. So I'm trying to inspire myself by reading, because I find if I read good books, then I feel inspired to go back to my own. So I spend a lot of time reading. So as I said, I'm a late riser, and my mornings are basically for what I call my media mornings. I do all my newspaper reading all on the phone, not physical newspapers or whatever. My evenings are the time that I spend time in the kitchen. I don't really do much cooking in the afternoon. I like spending time cooking in the evening. Maybe something very simple, or nothing very complicated. Maybe a pasta, or a dal, or whatever. I like making dinner for ourselves, like, because we travel so much. When we are in Delhi, we like to eat at home. So I don't mind going out for lunch, but dinner I like to have at home, because I like that sense of sitting down at the end of the day and having a meal together. And I watch a lot of streaming services as well after dinner. And my writing, as I told you, happens in the afternoon, which is when I do most of my work, because then everybody's gone off to do their own things, and so I'm alone at home. There's no distraction.
Almost like your mother's 2 to 4.
Yes, actually, yeah, quite. It is. So I have that little bit of dead time in the afternoon, so which is when I can concentrate and do my own thing. I can't do this thing that people do, like, I'm going to take 2 months off and write a book and just write the book. I can't do that. It has to be part of my everyday experience.
Tell me about friendships. Like, you've pointed out that in one of the advantages of Loreto being a girls' college, and therefore the male gaze being absent, you don't have to project yourselves in a particular way for boys. That particular anxiety is missing. And that also was, fertile ground for the development of deep friendships. And what I've also noticed is that female friendships tend to inhabit a deeper, more intimate space than male friendships do.
Yeah,
Male
true.
friendships are more at a surface level, and typically you'll talk Bollywood, you'll talk cricket, you'll do whatever, but
Yeah.
it can sometimes be superficial, unless you intentionally, like I do, try to make it a little more than that. But female friendships, a sisterhood as it were, can be deep, can sustain you for a long time. You've also got a great column on friendships where you talk about casual friends, lunch friends, dinner friends, and you've got all these categories. And I
Yeah.
presume all your friends after reading that column must have been like, कि सीमा आपने मुझे dinner के लिए नहीं बुलाया. I am not in that esteemed category. But tell me a bit about the friendships in your life, what they mean to you. Do you
Yeah.
make an effort to keep them going?
I have a lot of female friends. I'm basically a girl's girl. I don't have that many male friends. I bond more with women than I do with men. And so from my school days, actually, I was telling you about this neighbor of mine who we used to go when we were children, going out exploring the neighborhood. So she lives in Cal still, and we're still close friends. We still talk, and I just went down to Cal for her son's wedding. So she's somebody who's known me from the time I was born, because she's like a year older than me.
What's her name? Give a shout out.
Kavita Bagga. Actually, sorry, she's Kavita Walia now, but in my mind she's Kavita Bagga. Okay. But her pet name is Sweetie, and so I still call her Sweetie. In my mind, she's still that, though everybody else calls her Kavita. And So, the kind of memories we have together of growing up and childhood memories and going to school. In fact, even though she's a year older than me, we both went to school on the same day. Like, we entered school. I still remember the two of us holding hands and walking into the school and feeling very trepidatious about what was going to
Oh.
happen. But we still had each other. So we were like a little bit kind of confident about it. So I'm still friends with her. My college friends, most of them have moved out and they live abroad and things. So, I mean, I'm in touch with them, but I don't really meet them that often or anything. Though the other day in Khan Market, I was having lunch with another friend, and suddenly two girls who I went to college with were at the next table. And like, we were so hyper excited to see each other. I think we brought the restaurant down with us squealing and shouting. But most of my friends are actually from the time I started working, from the time I started working in Sunday and then with Telegraph. I mean, those are people who I'm still friends with, who started off as work friends, but they are still my friends. And then I made another set of friends when I moved to Delhi. So I have, like, different sets of friends. Some are journalistic friends, some are like wives of husbands who Veer is friendly with. So we have these different little groups. Not all of them intermingle, but I have my little friendships. And we always make it a point to, meet up at least once in a month or whatever, to have lunch or just to have a coffee if they don't have, time for lunch. And then of course there's WhatsApp. So there's a lot of WhatsApping going around. So actually I'm good with friendships.
One of the sort of dilemmas I face more and more in these times is how engaged to be with the world, especially with what is happening in our country. And that's my question for you also, that at one level, as a journalist, as someone who's in fact started off covering politics, seeing the political space so intimately, seeing how that's happened, at one level you've been a really engaged citizen just through your journalism to begin with, right? And at another level, I also feel really strongly sometimes the temptation to just step back from it, partly because it is so depressing, partly because it just seems pointless. There is sort of this famous phrase from Kashinath Singh in Kashikasi. I'll give a family friendly version of it: bhar mein jaye duniya, hum bajaye harmonia. Right? And sometimes I think ki, bhar mein jaye duniya, hum bajaye, I'm happy with my harmonia and just trying to sort of focus on the work that I do. And of course, even the work that I do is engaged and I'm playing the long game. But the temptation also is that it almost, one has a certain amount of emotional energy, and it almost becomes a choice between caring about the country and just working on self actualization, whatever that might mean. Like, do I want to read 5 angry columns about something I myself am angry about?
Yeah.
Or do I just want to sit quietly amid nature and read a few nice poems and all of that? Over the years, how have you dealt with that?
To be honest, I think I have retreated a bit from the political space because it's depressing. And like you said, you feel like there's not much you can do about it. But, there are some things that still touch you and anger you, like this whole Manipur thing, which kind of bring you back into the space, even though you don't really want to be in it. But it's a very depressing situation because you feel that your views or your opinions account for nothing in this country, which is a depressing place to be in. Like, you feel that people who think like you, it's a shrinking space. We don't really matter. The country has moved in a different direction, leaving us behind. And it's hard to come to terms with, in not just as a journalist, but just as a person, it's hard to come to terms with.
So, I've taken up a lot of your time. This was a great chat, and hopefully, we can do it again sometime.
Yes.
I'll end with a standard question I ask all my guests. For my benefit and for the benefit of all my listeners, recommend some books, films, music, any kind of art at all that means a lot to you and you love it so much that you want to share it with everyone.
Okay. I'm not big one for music, so I'll tell you about films. And which films would I recommend, which have meant a lot to me? It's so hard.
What was the last film that made you cry?
I can't think of any.
You don't cry.
No, I haven't seen any movies like that. My problem is that all the movies I go and see in film halls are the ones that are all about superheroes and, that kind of thing, which are not terribly moving,
The
unfortunately.
spectacle films and not the
Yeah,
intimate
yeah,
dramas.
it's quite sad actually. No, I can't think of any. But I think I would recommend that people watch Kohra, which was a really amazing show. I was telling you that it really resonated with me because it's set in Punjab and that whole milieu was really. The other streaming show I really like was this is a very sweet thing called Kathal, which is about the theft of kathals from this politician's house in UP or whatever, and how the police tries to retrieve them. It's actually like a almost like a dark satire, but it's a great fun thing. What else have I been watching? I was recommending to you that you should watch West Wing
Hmm.
because if you're if you're into politics or you're interested in politics, it's probably one of the better streaming things to watch. Books, my God, I love. I love reading a lot of spy novels, and I don't know if you read him. There's this author called Daniel Silva. Have you read him?
No.
So he's done this whole series of books. He's probably done 20 by now, and it's the hero is a man called Gabriel Allon, who is an Israeli art restorer who doubles as an assassin for Mossad. And it's basically his journey through life. He starts off as one of the people who that Munich, in Munich, where those Israelis were kidnapped,
Yeah.
and then there was Israel started this whole thing of tracking them down and killing them one by one. So in the books, he's one of the people who is tasked with killing them one by one, and then with every book, he's given a different task to do by his masters, and eventually ends up becoming the head of Mossad himself. At the moment, he's now retired and back in Venice working as an art restorer. So it's really fun watching the arc of his life, as it goes. And what I like about it is that, they don't portray Israel as the all knowing and, all seeing thing. There are all these gray things with Palestinians, and there are gray areas as well in terms of politics. So it's a very well written and very kind of balanced narrative of the region, which is good fun. So those are the things I like, and apart from that, I love reading Claire McIntosh. Do you like her?
I'm afraid I haven't read her either, but you're giving me a lot to discover,
Yeah,
and
so
I'm
this
grateful
is
for
good.
that.
I like doing these little book recommendations in my column. I do it twice a year for summer reading and winter reading, and and S.J. Bennett, which I told you about, where the Queen Elizabeth plays a detective. Those are good fun reads. Serious books, my gosh, I don't know.
These are all serious books. I
They're not
object to
serious.
that. Huh?
They're not
I
serious.
mean, all books are serious to
And
me.
one of the best books I've read is actually by Elizabeth Jane Howard.
Hmm.
They're called the Cazalet Chronicles. And there are 4 books in the series, and it tells the story of this kind of upper middle class British family from the kind of start before the war, and then the war happens, and then the post-war years, and how their fortunes fluctuate during that period. Some of the best pieces of writing. It's one of her best books, certainly. I really loved it.
I can't wait to go out and read all of these. Seema, this was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you. That was great fun. Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed listening to this conversation, check out the show notes, enter rabbit holes at will. Do go to your nearest bookstore, online or offline, and buy all of Seema's books, all of them, all 3 of them. You can follow her on Twitter at Seema Goswami, that's one word. You can follow me on Twitter at Amit Verma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.